Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Midwestern Marx live stream, coming at you from Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. Today, Carlos and I are going to be breaking down a handful of things, including some recent interviews about the conflict in Ukraine between Russia and NATO and the U.S., particularly what Bernie Sanders had to say about it, as well as the 12 points that were released by the People's Republic of China in reference to a political settlement in Ukraine. We're also going to talk about Andrew Tate, who did a viral, because everything he does is viral, but he did a viral interview about communism, talking about, what communism is and who runs the world and all sorts of stuff. All sorts of very confused stuff. So we're going to be breaking that down and pointing Andrew Tate on the right path, on the path to Marxism if he ever gets out of jail. And then we're also going to be talking about BlackStone and Vanguard. These giant sort of investment groups is what they're called, but they're just conglomerates of shareholders who invest in large amounts of stock, own shares in a ton of companies and are deeply connected to the largest banks in the West. So we'll talk about their place in the economy theoretically. And yeah, am I missing anything, Carlos?
Oh, I think that's good, man, and I'm excited to get this going today. So we'll jump right into our introductory video and then get into the themes of the day.
All right. That intro never gets old. Oh, there's some kind of echo. Do you know where that's coming from? Oh, it sounds like it went away. That was weird. Someone said cheesy intro, LOL, and it is just a little bit, but I think it's perfectly fitting for where our project's at right now. Not to say one day we won't have some, super well animated, high production value intro, but for right now, that intro gets to the heart of what our project's about, and it's fun to watch. I like it.
And the international, man. You almost want to get up, put the hand on the heart, take off the hat, Every time I hear the international, I'm reminded of, this might not be the most appreciated statement, but Joey Diaz, he's got these skits that he does about the American national anthem. We just need a Joey Diaz, but like that does that instead of the American national anthem with the international. And that would be good. We could play that like right after or right before we play the international.
That'd be perfect. It's too bad our 7th TikTok account got banned, which maybe I should have put that in the topics of things we should talk about today. But
yeah,
it's unfortunate that happened. Otherwise, I feel like that would make a great TikTok video. Play the international and just like, get up, motherfuckers. It's time to organize your workplace.
All we need is a communist Joey Diaz, and we're set to go.
We do. No, don't change it. All right, we won't. So, what topic do you want to get into first, Carlos? Do you want to talk about these giant investment groups like Vanguard and BlackRock, or do you want to hit on the conflict in Ukraine first?
Whatever you want. I think logically the large investment groups might be uh, first, just because of they characterize what the nature of imperialism is, and it is out of that we can properly understand the conflict in Ukraine. So.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing, and it's interesting that you say that too, because that's one of the main points that I've been trying to make in the first two chapters of the reading guide for Lenin's Imperialism. Is the first chapter is about the concentration of production, the concentration of industry. Then the second chapter is about the concentration of banking and finance capital and their merger to industry. And the third chapter is about the financial oligarchy and how finance capitalists capture the state apparatus. But this is a book about imperialism, and a lot of times we think of imperialism as warfare or coups or even economic sanctions, and this doesn't talk about any acts of state violence. In the first chapters, because Lenin laying the basis for imperialism, which does have to do with wars and sanctions and all these things. But it stems from finance capital. It stems from monopolization, and really it stems from the capitalist relations of production and their development over a long period of time, and the development of capitalist accumulation over a long period of time. So yeah, that's why these investment groups like Vanguard and BlackRock, who own huge amounts of shares in some of the most profitable companies in the country in various different industries, why they are important in understanding imperialism, because these are some of the major institutions, or the individuals who belong to these investment groups are some of the individuals who heavily lobby the government, heavily control the state apparatus in general, including the financial arms of the state apparatus. And they're closely linked to the banks still. So there are various ways that capitalism has developed since Lenin wrote this. And I think the formation of these investment groups are one of those things.
Absolutely, and we hope to, sometime after you finish the imperialism reading guide, to also go over an article by Cheng and Fu, who has been theorizing in the spirit of Lenin neo-imperialism, what he calls neo-imperialism. And there's this really good article published by Monthly Review called Five Characteristics of Neo-Imperialism, and it does kind of the same thing that Lenin does. Which I have my issues with people who just treat those five characteristics very mechanistically and vulgarly, and just on the basis of those apply it in a very mechanistic fashion to the world, in order to make statements like, oh, China's exporting capital, it's imperialist, or Russia's doing that, it's imperial. So we also have to remember that although these nice listicles of characteristics are good, in the sense that pedagogically they help a bunch of people remember the central characteristics of the phenomenon of capitalism at the stage of imperialism or neo-imperialism. We also have to remember, as Engels was very keen on noting in Anti-Düring, that definitions, although helpful in everyday life, are kind of the death of science in a way, because they abstract the phenomenon from the interrelations and movement in which it exists, and in a way prohibits you from having a correct scientific understanding of things. So it's, don't tie yourself down too much to definitions, and focus on studying the concrete concretely. And you'll find that, these characteristics will appear. They might appear in different forms thanks to the 100 years that have passed since Lenin's book. But and in connection with that, perhaps I can announce that in the coming months, we will be publishing a book by the Marxist economists, Alan Freeman and Radhika Desai, two of our favorite economists alive today, people who have a lot of valuable knowledge. And we'll be publishing a book by them that debunks all of the misconceptions that people have about imperialism, both how it's understood theoretically, but also how it is understood in terms of the geopolitical relations that exist in the world right now. And it's going to be kind of in the style of Terry Eagleton's Why Marx Was Right, where you'll have the misunderstanding and then a chapter debunking that. So we're extremely excited for that project, and very honored to be collaborating with folks like Radhika and Alan.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm redoing. Not only am I glad I'm rereading Lenin's Imperialism for my own sake, but like the fact that I'm doing a reading guide now, I hope I get to communicate with members of the audience who are at various levels with their development and their understanding of a lot of Marxist concepts, for lack of a better word, and what are their main misconceptions about imperialism. What are the main questions they have about imperialism. Kind of want to get a sense of that from people who aren't already, or who haven't already been reading this kind of stuff for more than 3-4 years. So yeah, I'm excited for that, and like Carlos said, just super pumped to be working with scholars like that. People know that Radhika has been huge for my own development, my own understanding of Marx and Marx's Capital especially, whereas some of the other reading guides I felt were tainted by neoclassical economics and tainted by modern bourgeois scholarship or narratives about economics, whereas hers were not. And not only that, but she points out that some of the other reading guides that you'll see are tainted by that, and it helps things make a lot more sense your first time through. So really appreciate her for that. Kind of got off topic a little bit there, but it's all related. This is one of the articles I wanted to show today, that this BlackStone shareholder received over $1 billion in dividends. So it's usually how it works. These investment groups own huge amounts of shares or stock in profitable companies that are publicly traded. They're considered public, but that doesn't mean public ownership. It means they're shares are available to anyone, or for anyone to buy, but of course the people with the most money are going to buy majority shares. So that's essentially what these investment groups do. They take people's money and invest it in shares that'll be profitable, which leads to giant dividend payments or stock buybacks. And what's weird about it, though, is like these investment groups usually don't release who their shareholders are. Like it might be public information, but it's definitely not something that you can just Google. It's not something that they make publicly available. Maybe you'd be able to get it through like a Freedom of Information Act or something. I don't know. I guess that wouldn't apply because that usually is aimed at the government. But either way, this article is one of the first articles that I've seen, or popular articles I've seen, that just said the name of one of these BlackRock shareholders. I guess this is BlackStone. So different than BlackRock. But either way, it's one of these giant investment groups. And I think they help protect the anonymity of the finance capitalists who everyone pretty much recognizes run the world. And it's a new form, or a modern form, of probably capitalist trust or combine, is what Lenin talks about them, or calls them in Imperialism, which are just conglomerations of finance capital, banking capital, bankers, and industrial capital. And the stock market in many ways serves as a reflection of industrial capital, because you can buy stock in an industrial manufacturer, and then you're going to get some of the profits from that as dividends. So these giant investment groups own huge swaths of the stock market, meaning they control giant sections of industry, which is why, Bill Gates owns a huge percentage of the American farmland. He's just bought up all these shares, despite the fact that he knows nothing about the labor processes involved in agriculture, what it takes to produce food in terms of their use value. Despite that, he still gets all the profits from it and is in control of it. Yeah, I guess that's all I got to say.
I wanted to point out that I find that often people tend to overemphasize like the individual billionaires and multi-billionaires. And I think it's important to remember that all these people just exist as personifications of capital. Like they play a role that the system necessarily creates, and that role could have been filled by pretty much anyone else. That's not to say that they don't have, you know, a level of agency in their investments, but on the general level, like I think it's important to focus on how it is that it's the system that creates this, because often I find this. Sorry, I got a crying baby in the background, but often I find it, especially with folks that are on the right, that they get very bogged down into like the individual connections, and they are able to very meticulously track the interconnections of the individual capitalists and the individual firms and all that stuff. And I think that's all well and good for the sake of concretizing our understanding of our current economy and who the individual agents are. And it also plays an important role in showing basically the nakedness of inequalities under capitalism and the contradictions of capital, which are heightened more than ever in our stage of neo-imperialism. But it's important to remember the systematic character, and I think that that's often what separates like the proper Marxist analysis from some of these other analyses that come from the right, that delve more specifically in forms of discourse about these billionaires that get close to, you know, tinfoil hat talking points. It's important to keep an eye to the totality and to the fact that it's the system which creates, you know, these despicable figures like this that are drowning in abundance, don't even know what to do with their abundance, while there's mass poverty all over the country and, of course, all over the world because of their system.
Absolutely. And that's actually some of the points that I want to hit on when we talk about that Andrew Tate video later on. He, you know, recognizes some of the faults of the system, you know, essentially, not to spoil it, but what he recognizes are finance capitalists from the world. But he's got these ideas about them being the new world order, you know, or just a handful of super evil capitalists who control everything, who aren't motivated by money or profit. They're just motivated by control, which, you know, in many ways, money is a representative of control. But it's not just that these people are evil. You know, even Lenin points this out too. Even when you have the formation of monopolies and the concentration of capital into just a few hands, a, you know, very small amount of people, all this wealth and control, like what we have today, they still have to expand their profits, expand their control of markets, and obey the normal laws of capitalism. It's just that rather than having an individual capitalist at the head of every factory, you know, they're concentrated into a few giant capitalists, but they still have to deal with competition. They still have to continually grow. They're still subject to crises like in 2008 when we saw the giant banks and monopolies come crashing down. So similar thing happened with the Great Depression. So they're still subject to the laws of capitalism, no matter how much they concentrate. And ultimately, there's still, or the capitalist class still acts as a personification of capital. It's not, you know, the individual moral evil of these people, which is partially why in the Journal of American Socialist Studies, in my article about healthcare, we talk about the opioid crisis and the concentration of capital in healthcare, and how the vast majority of important functions in healthcare, or important institutions that perform these functions in healthcare, are owned by conglomerates, which are controlled, or majority shares are owned by groups like Vanguard Investment Group, or BlackRock Investment Group, who are getting millions and millions of dollars in shareholder payouts from the healthcare industry every year, from selling you things like medicine, selling you things like surgery. And this has led to various things like the percentage of C-section births has gone way up, even though there are extra risks to the baby and the mom if you perform a C-section and they don't need it. And C-sections are a great medical procedure, right, for in cases where they do help the mom and the baby, where a natural birth would be more dangerous. But now, because C-sections make more money, make more profit for the shareholders and conglomerates who own the healthcare system, they've started pushing C-sections, even though there are added risks to the point where it's now like 33% of births. And that's a pretty mild example of a place where they put exchange value and surplus value over use value in healthcare. But then you have the opioid crisis, where these conglomerates.
Eddie, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but your mic is very, very glitchy.
It's very glitchy.
Yeah, I don't know why. I think the audio might be a bit too high.
Shit. How about now?
It sounds the same.
What do you mean by glitchy?
Choppy. That's another word that people used in the chat. Someone said crunchy as well. I think it might be the audio on StreamYard that it might be too high. Someone said Robot Eddie's here to bring automated communism. Yes. I think it's back to normal, by the way.
It is.
Yeah, sorry. I just didn't want you to do the
volume.
I didn't want you to finish the whole rant and then only tell you after that, maybe half of it was
I appreciate it. It sounds better now, though?
Yeah, it sounds perfect now. I should have probably stopped you sooner, but I didn't know how long you were going.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. Maybe it won't make a good YouTube video now, but it'll still be all right to kick off the stream. What was I saying? So most of the important functions in healthcare are carried out by for-profit conglomerates or nonprofits, which are tied to, intimately connected to for-profit conglomerates. So they work together on behalf of these shareholders and healthcare executives. And if you look at the top, I think I go through the top 5 most profitable corporations or institutions in the American healthcare system. And BlackRock Investment Group and Vanguard Investment Group are top 5 shareholders in every single one of them. So whoever these anonymous shareholders are who are connected to BlackRock and Vanguard are making millions and millions, raking in money hand over fist from selling overpriced healthcare commodities. And yeah, I was using the example of how they've pushed C-section births rather than the natural deliveries because it makes more money. And that's a pretty mild example of how they put exchange value and surplus value ahead of use value, or how they prioritize it above use value. One of the worst ones is the opioid crisis, where these corporations, we now know groups like Purdue Pharma, who were owned by the Sackler family, who are still one of the wealthiest families in America, and who, basically do the same thing now. They just changed the name from Purdue Pharma to some other name, but it's still a pharmaceutical company that sells OxyContin and opioids. And these conglomerates spent millions and millions and millions of dollars not only marketing opioids to patients, but marketing them to physicians, marketing them to providers, and pushing them in medical schools, so that anybody who came out against opioids was smeared as being opiophobic and not caring about their patients because they just want their patients to suffer. And they basically barred any doctor from talking about the risks, talking about the risks of addiction, to the point now where we have like 60,000 overdose deaths a year from fentanyl. or maybe even more than that, but 60,000 of them are people who get hooked directly from pharmaceutical opioids, where they're prescribed opioids and they eventually run out of money and they turn to street drugs. Huge increases in heroin overdoses. Same thing, when people can't afford the prescriptions, they often switch to heroin. And overall, well over 100,000 deaths a year due to the opioid crisis. And like I said, the Sackler family, who largely masterminded this whole thing, is still at the head of a super profitable pharmaceutical company selling OxyContin. So these shareholders like Vanguard and Investment and these anonymous combines of capital, there's a reason they want to stay anonymous. If people knew, or people can see how much of the actual economy they own and how much they control, and how many people's lives they've destroyed. So they want to remain as anonymous as possible. And it only makes sense that they would combine their shares into these investment groups, so that they can make as much money as possible while taking as little flack as possible.
Right, and I also think that there's a way in which their anonymity serves mystification, and mystification, brings about two. It brings about two effects which are favorable to the existing order. One, which is that it very easily lends itself to tinfoil hat conspiracy theories, which then, when people have a proper analysis of the existing order, and then mention the concrete agents partaking as the agents of capital, the personifications of capital, the personifications of imperialism, it's very easy for the mainstream narrative and jargon to connect the crazy conspiracy theory to the people that are actually engaging with the truth in a concrete manner. And also, by mystifying them, it brings about this aura of undefeatability. Like, it makes it seem very far away. People like using the word deep state. I don't necessarily like using it. I'll use it because I know that it's a word that a lot of working class people have in their regular jargon, especially if they listen to politics from the right. And there is something in the sentiment of the word deep state, which can be very easily turned towards, I think, a right direction, into a discussion of imperialism and the way that capitalists, by the very nature of the laws of capital, have to combine with each other and collaborate in such a form so as to extend the interests of capital forward. And how this collaboration, by necessity, means that the interest of the vast majority of people are being left out and are being stomped on, and that their interest necessarily means that the interests of other people, the vast majority of people, are in contradistinction with one another. But I also wanted to mention that there's a Richard Wolff interview that he does with Fox Business, and the interviewer, when Wolff mentions the inequality that exists in the U.S. between like the billionaires and then the homeless people, the interviewer says, that's just the market. That's just the market. And the first response that Wolff gives, it's fairly good, which he says, this whole response mechanism that you have of just blaming it on the market, it's a way to remove the responsibility that individual agents have in controlling the market. The market is not this abstract, mystical God. It's composed of concrete individuals making real decisions and engaging in real relations with each other. And I think that's largely a correct answer. But the second one that he gives is far better, which is him saying that by them saying that it's the market, it's basically them saying that it's the system, right? And that means that these decisions that these problems that we see in our society, they're not accidental, they're not arbitrary. You can't pin them back to specific individuals, specific companies, and just have this logic of villainhood, where it's just these small villains that if once you get rid of them, everything else functions nicely. The system necessarily creates these outcomes. It's in the very nature of a system that has to accumulate capital in the hands of a few, and that can't stop. It needs to constantly grow this process of accumulation. So I think that, talking about BlackRock, Vanguard, and all these different groups is really good, but it's important to remember that what they are is a symptom of an agent that necessarily has to exist in this system.
Yeah, one of the things I've been noticing a lot as I read volume 2, which I am 80% done with exactly as of today, which has to deal a lot with the circulation of commodities. And, sometimes when you're reading volume 1, you wonder why Marx focused this whole volume just on production. And why he starts the first 3 chapters with this detailed and sometimes confusing analysis of the commodity form itself. And this is something Carlos and I were talking about today, actually. I sent him an audio message asking about it. But Marx spends so much time talking about the contradiction within the commodity form itself, or the twofold forms of value within the commodity form. You have exchange value, how much value a commodity has on the market in relation to other commodities. And then you have its use value, its useful character, what it's actually used for. And as I'm studying healthcare too, at the graduate level, the longer I look at the system, the more I realize that pretty much every issue stems from that contradiction within the commodity, and the fact that the basis of production in our society is commodity production in its most highly developed form. So we can talk about the concentration of capital at the highest level, where capital has accumulated, what these industries look like today. But, ultimately the reason that corporations are in control of healthcare and they're putting their own surplus value above everything else is because it all stems from the relations of production and that contradiction within the commodity, because they're selling healthcare as a commodity. Capitalism commodifies everything, and then every industry becomes a race to see who can sell the most commodities and pay the least for them. So yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of rambling at this point. I had somewhere where I wanted to go with that, and I lost it halfway through and tried to find my way out. But the
Well,
commodity
I think it's telling, to the efficiency to the inefficiency, I should say, of the system in providing for better living standards for people, that in the 1970s with the crash, capitalists have a decision to make in terms of reinvestment. The rate of profit had been falling for decades, and it wasn't very profitable to invest in productive industry, to invest in rebuilding the highways, rebuilding the infrastructure of the country, building, new things that actually help people. That wasn't very profitable. So they had 2 routes to go besides that, either export that productive industry elsewhere, where they can have, access to cheaper resources and cheaper labor, which they did that, and that gets intensified in the 90s with NAFTA, or financialization. Go down the route of speculation and making profit out of interest, making profit out of rents and different forms of relation to a form of expanding capital, which is unproductive. And the only 2 exceptions in the US specifically has been the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex and the military industrial complex. And those are both industries of death, specifically because of how they function in relationship to the profit motive. You talked about the opioid crisis in a very elaborate and detailed form in that article from Jazz that you did for our recent issue. But these people literally collaborated, the companies, with the government, with NGOs, with universities, with doctors. They collaborated with everyone in order to promote a drug that today kills 60,000 Americans yearly. This is just criminal. It's an industry of death. And the paradox is that it's an industry that's supposed to be the opposite of that. It's an industry that's supposed to cure. But because of the profit motive, you have cases like the opioid epidemic. You can even speak about the COVID crisis as a similar fumbling of the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex. And this naturally leads to a population that just doesn't trust the people that are supposed to be there to cure them and to ensure that they're living healthy lives, and that if they're sick, that they can get healthy. And just you can see the staggering difference between the trust in medicines and in medical institutions in the U.S. with a country like Cuba, where the emphasis is on prevention, since profit is taken out. The idea of even having preventive healthcare just doesn't make any fucking sense in the US, because all you're doing by preventing sickness is preventing more profit from being realized in the future, because sick people means profit. And when you live in a society where medicine is itself, the end of medicine is no longer to cure but profit, these sort of contradictions come to light in a much more pronounced and profound and naked form than they do in other areas. And that's why I think that what really gravitated a lot of people to Bernie's style of socialism, for all its flaws, is his critique of commodified healthcare, because it's just so blatantly there how irrational it is.
It is. I mean, I had a long-term illness as a kid, and this isn't something I talk about a ton, but it relates here. And the conclusion that my mom and I made after going to a lot of doctors and trying to get stuff figured out, as far as my health went, was that the mainstream modern medical system was essentially broken, that they were essentially trying to sell you antibiotics or surgery, sell you some procedure that costs money. And if those can't fix you, if those can't fix your health problems, then you're shit out of luck. They're going to turn you away, or even tell you that, you're faking it, or that your symptoms are subjective or something. And as Howard Waitskin goes over in his really good book, The Second Sickness, there's all these ways that capitalism is making people sick by overworking them, exploiting them, leaving them in poverty, not giving them enough time, to fulfill the needs that people need, as far as rest and even, human relations, social relations. So it's making people sick in all these ways. But then the doctor's job is to make you feel better, to take your symptoms away. So your doctor can't say, well, you're overworked, take 2 weeks off of work, and just hang out with your family, because your boss isn't going to let you do that. They need to exploit your labor. So it's a lot easier for your doctor to just give you an opioid that takes your symptoms away, numbs the pain, numbs your symptoms. So it's been really interesting after having that long-term illness as a kid, going back and re-examining the healthcare system from a Marxist lens, being like, oh, it's because the whole system's profit-based. This is not to say, there's nothing good that's come from modern medicine, or no good technologies. And, my family and I recognized this even back in the day, that there were a lot of useful and valuable medical technologies. It's just that they're not distributed, not utilized in a way that's, based on preventative care, like you said, Carlos, holistic care, incorporating the mental, physical, and environmental factors. It's not administered in a way that's efficient and aimed at getting the best health outcomes for the patient, the patient population. So this, and like you said, it stems from the commodification of healthcare, and the fact that this is an industry that is used to make profit, of course, like any industry. And it's been financialized like every industry in the country.
Right. And it leads me to think, when you look at just how many trillions dollars worth.
I got to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back. Sorry.
Okay. When you look at how many trillions dollars worth, the medical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex makes in profits and owns, it kind of seems like the utopian position would be to think that you can undo these evils with reforms. That's what seems to me to be the real, because that requires a level of political will that the capitalist state apparatus will never have. If anything, just by the mere fact that, the medical and pharmaceutical industrial complex lobby is one of the ones that funds most of the campaigns of local and presidential candidates. It's right up there, almost with the military-industrial complex. So I think it's, for these policies that are accepted by 80-something% of Americans, like Medicare for all, and just providing healthcare on a universal basis, stepping up to a position that the rest of the world, especially the developed world, has had for basically the last 70 to 100 years. The only way to actually realize these things would be through a radical transformation of society. It's not going to be possible, I think, today to take one of the most profitable industries, one of the industries that contributes the most to political candidates, and just nationalize it or make it work on the basis of single payer healthcare. And so I don't know, there's the way we think about reformist politics today is very interesting, because I think that in a lot of cases it's even more utopian to think that the accomplishments which people want in terms of reforms can be obtained through reforms. I think that there's the willingness is just not there to acquire them through reforms, regardless of how much struggle there is. So I do think that these very basic things that the vast majority of the American people want are only going to be genuinely achievable through a revolutionary movement. So yeah, let's see the chat, because Eddie left me alone. Yes, Joey Diaz is a big gusano. There was a question that I wanted to answer that was more philosophical in character. It's from Ryan Finnerty. Can you explain reification for me? It's actually a very easy concept if you break it down etymologically. It's composed of two root words that come from Latin. One of them is res, which means thing. So in Descartes, for instance, you hear him speak about the res cogitas and the res extensa, the extended, the mental thing, and then the extended thing. So res just means thing. And then the other word is facade, which means to make. So when you put it together, reification or res facade, it really means to make something into a thing. It's a process of thingification, right? If you are struggling with the word reification because you don't hear it often, think about the word thingification. And this is something that is at the core of capitalist production in the very commodity. Remember that the last section of the first chapter of Capital deals with the fetishism of commodities, and that is a process through which human relations are made to appear into relations between things, and relations between things are then personalized to appear as relations between humans. It's a complete inversion of the mechanisms and the relations that actually are in the background of a commodity. And it takes an objective character in a system of commodity production. It's not just something that you can change your approach as an individual to by, remembering, that your eggs come from this ranch or from that ranch. As soon as you're engaging with commodity production, the fetishism of commodity obtains an objective character, and it's grounded in that inversion, making human relations as into relations between things, and the thing that's produced out of that into this thing that has its own qualities separate from the human interactions, which in reality it presupposed. And so you start to see things like price as things that are inherent in the commodity that you're observing. In that phenomenon, which Marx describes as the fetishism of commodities, in Lukács, it's theorized as reification. And although Lukács is the first person to introduce that concept of reification in a published work, Marx actually used it in a variety of places in manuscripts. And the German word that they use is the same. So that's the short little ramble on reification that someone had asked earlier.
It's interesting that Radhika Desai says in one of her Capital breakdowns that, as I was saying earlier, really helped me understand it and understand Marxism a lot better. She says that she was teaching volume 1 with another professor, and the other professor, or they got to commodity fetishism, and the other professor was like, oh, that's consumerism, and then just moved on. And she was like, well, hold on. Let's go back to commodity fetishism because it's a little bit more than consumerism. And consumerism can be linked to commodity fetishism, but there are all these different ways, in which commodity fetishism is shown to be a real thing, or it explains so much about capitalism and capitalism's illusory character, which I was talking with another one of our friends the other day about how capitalism is the most illusory system. It's the hardest system to see how, what its real inner workings are. And you really have to dismantle it and take it apart bit by bit, which is why these capital books here are so dang long. But
Right.
yeah.
It definitely provides, it's a constant veil that's put over real relations. And I told you before we started streaming that I've been digging into Lukács's Destruction of Reason and this other chapter that deals with something similar. It's called The Crisis of Bourgeois Philosophy, from his book on existentialism. And one of the things that he says is that it's not only the case there in that germ of capitalist production, which is the commodity, but as you move farther away from that, the more pronounced the contradictions are, and the more difficult it is to go beyond the veil, to go beyond the superficial layer. And that's why he had very little faith in bourgeois philosophers actually seeing reality. They were constantly doomed to be engaging with this very superficial level at which they engaged with reality. And that's not a downfall specifically of them as individuals. It's just the objective character that things take under commodity production, which is at its core, a contradictory form of value production. And that's why what's so important about your article, the recent one, criticizing neoclassical economics, postmodernism, and the way that certain Marxist economists have just accepted the dogmas of neoclassical economics and rejected the labor theory of value, is that if you reject the labor theory of value, you're not able to see that phenomenon. You're not able to see how in the germ of the capitalist mode of life and in the commodity, you already have a contradiction, and how out of that base contradiction develops a whole host of other contradictions. And then what a general crisis of capital is, it's really all of the contradictions that are developed out of that manifesting themselves all at once. And that's something that Marx is very clear in describing in Theories of Surplus Value. But if you're a Marxist and you get rid of the labor theory of value, I don't even know if you can be called a Marxist, because you have to. It's so foundational for everything else, and that's why I think that the work that Cockshott and that Radhika Desai and Alan Freeman are doing is just so important, because what we do in the realm of philosophy, criticizing the Frankfurt School, post-Marxism, and all these different philosophical tendencies that present themselves as Marxism or radical, and that are actually, what Gabriel Rockhill calls radical recuperators, what the CIA agent Thomas Braden called the compatible left, what I call, agents of a controlled counter-hegemony. There's a bunch of terms to describe them, but we tend to focus on those philosophers, critical theorists, and how they distort Marxism in order to make it compatible with the existing order. The beauty of Radhika, Allen, Cockshott, and other Marxist economists is that they see that the same thing happens in so-called mainstream Marxist economics, where the essence of Marxism is completely tossed out while they try to sustain the label, the superficial image of Marxism. So it's just so important, and it's really good to see the overlap of two tendencies in different disciplines that are criticizing what passes in their disciplines as Marxism, but in reality it's just a domesticated form that is compatible with the existing institutions of the academy, NGOs, the media, and everything else in capitalist society.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked the article. It's unbelievable to me, especially after writing that so many Marxists or so-called Marxists throw out labor theory of value, just throw out LTV, or just concede it to the neoclassicals, despite the fact that the neoclassicals have never provided a scientific or a well-evidenced theory in their lives. They just, point to this utility theory of value without any kind of proof or any kind of evidence or mechanisms for how it works. And they just resolve the value of all commodities into the price of those commodities. And I did go back for the article and I read what David Harvey had said about the labor theory of value, because I like David Harvey, and it was kind of surprising to me that he kind of conceded that the LTV to the neoclassicals, and it wasn't as bad as I originally had thought. He says that the labor theory of value is still very useful. It allows us to trace value through the capitalist system, and it allows us to look at value production. But he throws out the idea that there's any relation between price and value, because he says, there's certain things that are valued way above or priced way above their value. So therefore we can throw it out. But, you have to look at you have to do what Cockshot does, and you have to look at labor time in every industry versus the commodities in that industry and their prices, measure the correlation, and then also understand that pricing and the expression of every commodity's exchange value is imperfect. It's an abstraction of value. It's an attempt to represent, value numerically, quantitatively. And this is never going to be perfect, which is something Marx talks about a ton. It stems from the contradiction between abstract and concrete labor, which is something I know David Harvey understands. He talks about it thoroughly in his breakdowns of Capital. So I don't get why he can't draw the two and two, or draw the connection then that, it's not worth throwing out the labor theory of value, and, it's the effect of a commodity's labor value on a commodity's price, just because the neoclassicals are popular in academia, because they're propped up literally by millions and millions of dollars from the Koch brothers. And all these different corporations that you can read about in Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money.
Right. Well, it seems like he's trying to, what's the expression, have his cake and eat it too, which I've never really understood why that is an expression that accurately captures what it's trying to say. It makes no fucking sense to me. But if you say that you think the labor theory of value is helpful, but not for talking about price, then you don't think it's helpful, because we engage with prices. Prices, that it's one of the more concrete categories in the projection, in the process of categorical developments in Marx's Capital, for a reason, right? Because it's the thing that most directly reflects how it is that we actually engage with the world. Right? When you go to the store, you don't have, in front of the product that you're going to buy, you don't have the exchange value. You have a price, right? And that's what people actually engage with. And so when you say that the labor theory of value is good, but not to talk about prices, then you're saying it's not good in essence, because that's how things get realized. They get realized into prices when they're sold, because someone paid the price. That's how profit is realized. So you're tossing out, again, everything. And I think
just that's why it's kind of shocking to see that so many Marxists have gone away from it. And the other thing people say is that Marx ignores supply and demand, which anyone who says that hasn't read Capital. Like, even Volume 1 talks about supply and demand shocks, and especially Volume 2. It just doesn't do it in the same way as Alfred Marshall, where he pulls these supply and demand curves out of his ass and draws their points randomly on the graph with no reason in order to say it determines price. Marx talks about, when demand goes way up for a commodity for whatever reason, a change in conditions, what effect that has on the market when a bunch of people rush to that market with their money to try and buy that commodity. So it's a scientific way of looking at it. But
well, people seem to have a fetish of a graph, where they see a graph and they're like, science.
Yeah.
And so they don't see a lot of graphs in Marx's Capital, and they're like, speculation. But You know, it's for someone to say that the categories that appear at the beginning of Marx's Capital, value, and the various forms it takes, are true, but then that the ones that appear at the end are false, or that the ones at the beginning do not correspond to the one at the end, is to say at the same time that the ones in the beginning are both true and not true. Because the ones at the beginning contain implicitly in itself their unfolding into the ones at the end. So if you reject the development of those early categories into the later categories, you can't do that. You're landing yourself into a contradiction, and not, the good ones. You're landing yourself into a genuine contradiction of thought where, the capacity to achieve any truth is stopped. It's like saying that, the acorn is true, but the pine tree is false, and the acorn's development into the pine tree, it's false. That doesn't make any sense. Or, to bring it back to Hegel's favorite example, the bud is true, but the transition from the bud to the flower is false. That doesn't make any fucking sense. You can't, you either say the whole thing is false, or you describe whether there was any moment in the transition from the bud to the flower that was wrong. You can't say it's good here, but bad here, because the second here is dependent on the validity of the first here. So if you say the first here is valid, then the second here has to be valid. And that's, the categorical ascension from the abstract to concrete. It's not just that the later categories must be understood in light of how they're produced by the unfolding of the earlier ones, how the more abstract categories give way to the more concrete ones, but it's also true the other way around. The more abstract categories, in order to understand them in the most concrete form as possible, you need to see them in light of how it is that they unfold into the more concrete categories, right? Schopenhauer used to have a saying, and I'm not a big fan of Schopenhauer, but he used to have a saying that every good book should be read twice, because you can only understand the beginning in light of the end. And that's almost a common sense saying. Like, you can only understand, Godfather as a whole once you see the 3 volumes and go back and rewatch the first one, because then you see what the first one unfolds into. And it's the same thing with Marx's Capital and the category unfolding there. You really understand fully the first few categories once you see what they develop into. And for Harvey to say that, that development is untrue, is for him to reject the whole project of Marx's Capital.
Right. The whole thing is, and Harvey knows this too because he admits it, the whole thing is taking the labor theory of value and using it to trace capital and value it through its entire motion, through the entire system. So it's like, to hear I remember it discouraged me when he said, Marx's Capital is taking the labor theory of value and to its conclusion, actually following value that's produced through the whole system. But the labor theory of value isn't really true anymore. And now we, believe these neoclassicals. It's like, well, what the hell am I reading this book for then? It kind of, like you said, if you take out that link or that basis for the whole project, it makes the whole project, or ruins your understanding of the whole project. So that's why I wanted to do that article for people like me when I was first starting out reading Capital.
They want, and they've always wanted, Western Marxists have always wanted this. They want to bring Marxism down from a science into an ethic. They want to talk about Marxism as a form of morality, as a form of ethical thinking, and they want to get away from the science. Because for the critics of Marxism, it's a whole lot harder to beat it at the level of science than to beat it at the level of moral claims about inequality being wrong. This is something that Adam Schaff, he was the, one of the I think the within the Ministry of Education in Socialist Poland, he became critical after and, went the route of social democracy, as most professors did in that region after the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union. But he said this in one of his most famous books, Marx and the Concept of Man, I believe that's what it's called, if I recall correctly. He says that, the Marxist humanists, they really want to reduce Marx into an ethical thinker, only an ethical thinker, because once you remove the science, it's a whole lot easier to beat Marxism in an argument. To have, you know, the reactionaries and the representatives, the bourgeois ideologues, to beat Marxism if it's just morality. But let them beat, you know, the science that you have in the 3 volumes of Capital and theories of surplus value, and people like Lenin and in other theorists of the 20th century that have carried forth in a genuine fashion the scientific analysis of Marx in the late 19th century. So
that's an interesting way of putting it, because in the Jordan Peterson video we just did, like, I made that point, he moralizes everything, brings everything down to the moral level, and then says his opponents are morally abhorrent, whereas he is morally upright, you know. But he never engages with the facts, never engages with the actual science of it. So that is interesting. Before we move on to the next segment, I want to take a second to thank our Patreon supporters and our YouTube members, as well as our Twitch subscribers. Thank you. Hold on. Oh no, wrong one. I didn't mean to laugh at y'all. Here we go. This is for our Patreon supporters. Thank you. Thank you. YouTube members as well, and Twitch subscribers. Our Patreon supporters, $10 Patreon Marx tier supporters are A. Coco, Amazaline, Andrew Tibbetts, Anna Williams, Ariel, Benjamin Calvet, Brady, Bryce Rafa, Burnt Reynolds, Christopher Stombaugh, CJ Cody, David Burney, David Rock, Debbie Hode, Dennis, DRRD, Elliot Cook, Gabe Glazer, Galactic Beyond, Gilly Trice, Glenn Goldman, Hobie Huckle, Jorge, Hakon Klepe Norman, Ian Snyder, Iraj Rafiq, Isaac Hone, Jack Kelleher, Jeremy Bishop, Joseph Hoffer, Julia P67, Christopher Bussell, Loaf of Kropotkin, Lucas Meadows, Marvin Roman, Philip Gendralt, Pranav Simha, Semi-Anonymous, Sergio Puchetta, The Day Tiva, Tom Smith, Uncle Joey, Victorio R. Witt, Xenon Tuning, aka Moon Factor, and Zach Quesenberry. So thank you to all our $10 Patreon supporters with $10 Patreon Marx tier, we call it. You get an ebook of the Journal of American Socialist Studies whenever it comes out. You get an ebook of the Journal of American Socialist Studies too. And you also get a shout out every stream or every other stream or most streams. So shout out to our $10 patrons. What we do would not be possible without you. We also have our $10 YouTube members, which is a new feature that YouTube has where you can basically be a Twitch subscriber. This, you get same benefits as the Patreon supporters. You get access to the Discord, I think, the special server in the Discord. And you also get the Journal of American Socialist Studies ebook. But in addition to that, you get some emotes. You can use, like, they're basically emojis of me and like Carlos, like custom emojis of us with the hammer and sickle and stuff. So shout out to Christopher Bussell, Duck Hash Browns, Red Scary, Insomniac 2007, Illinois State Fishing, Dustin Schlesinger, and Layla for being our very first YouTube members and supporting the project in that way. So yeah, shout out to all those financial supporters. Like I said, what we do would not be possible without you. Yeah, big thanks. Solidarity. So without further ado, I think we should move on to our main event, the meat and potatoes of our stream today, the Andrew Tate response. Just kidding. I know Carlos and I were most looking forward to talking about the theoretical topics that we discussed today, but we got to give the people what they want too. And we know the people love responses to folks like Andrew Tate, or folks like Jordan Peterson, who I responded to recently. So this is a video I saw, pretty viral video of Andrew Tate talking about communism. Pretty much everything Andrew Tate says goes viral. But right now he's still in a Romanian prison, as far as I know. So on sex trafficking charges. But this is a pretty interesting video. I think it'll give us a chance to talk about a couple topics that we hit on often or think are important. So yeah, but first I want to ask you, Carlos, what are your thoughts on Andrew Tate? What do you know about him? Are you excited for this video?
I don't know. From one day to another, my whole feed anywhere I was Andrew Tate, and then from one day to another, it just stopped being Andrew Tate. A lot of statements that I would consider somewhat misogynistic that I would definitely disagree with. Other statements about young men, just basically developing an ethic of I want to say virtue, but I don't think the way he thinks about it is very virtuous. But an ethic of like growth and development and trying to be your best self, which I think it's positive. It's something that the right loves to lean on, because I think there's a genuine crisis of that, and it's not because of people's individually bad characters. It's just capitalism, right? It creates conditions where it's extremely difficult for people to engage in fruitful labor that they're able to relate to in a de-alienated fashion, labor that they feel that it's fulfilling, that allows them to, every few months just feel like they're genuinely living a fruitful life, that like what they're doing with their life is fruitful. And, that's not a problem of like, liberal culture or conservative. It's a problem of capitalism, specifically at the stage that we're in, which is the most advanced stage of capitalism, where the contradictions are the most heightened, and capitalism is showing itself to be a system on the way out, a moribund system. All the evils of it intensify in a variety of different areas, whether that's depression, rise in suicide rates, anxiety, whatever the case might be. And I think that the reason why he speaks to a lot of these people is just because there's a complete absence of relating all of these evils to capitalism, which is in reality where it actually stems from.
Yeah, I have similar thoughts on Tate. That's interesting to hear you say. I think he's, a bourgeois ideologue for sure. I mean, he'll criticize the system and the people who run it. And like you said, he tells people to get rich so that they can have financial freedom and do whatever they want and not be alienated at a 9 to 5, job as a cog in the capitalist machine. But the way he tells you to do it is, by pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, or in his case, he was engaging in, sex trafficking and the sex trade, which is like, that's how you, get it. That's how you de-alienate in capitalism. That's how you get ahead. That's how you get freedom. And it's honestly similar to Jordan Peterson. Like, there are good aspects of what Jordan Peterson says and, his stuff about personal responsibility and, try and be a good person and have goals and things that drive you in life, that you care about in life. But then he says, just clean your room, work really, really hard, do your job to the best of your ability, but then never look up and, criticize the world around you. Never, ever, ever look up and criticize the system that you're in. Just keep your head down and work, and only criticize yourself internally. And, you can aspire to be great and aspire to develop yourself. And try and be the best individual that you can be within a capitalist system, while also criticizing the system. And in fact, you should. I think that's the best and the most virtuous person you can be, is someone who tries to be a good person in your everyday life, but who also takes the time to educate yourself about the world around you, and then criticize that system and try and make it better, try and make it the most conducive to human flourishing, which obviously capitalism is not. And that is, I was going to link that to Andrew Tate somehow. Now I can't think of how I was going to do it, but yeah. Do you have something to say, Carlos?
Yeah, I mean, someone here said Andrew Tate is neoliberalism personified, and the ethic is fuck y'all, I got mine. Yeah, it's very much grounded in what Du Bois would call the American assumption that with hard work you can get enough property and eventually be free and be rich, and have enough leisure time where you can do whatever you want most of the time, and that definitely has not been true in the U.S. for at least a good 150 years. And it was never true for a good portion of the population. It was never true for women, for Black people, for indigenous people. It was true for, in a very limited sense, for a very small amount of people. But what I wanted to say is that Andrew Tate, I think, is the conservative wing of this ideology, which also manifests itself in a reflected form through wokeism, because you also see it repeatedly through Netflix shows. They're basically saying the same thing, but from a more socially liberal standpoint. He's like that ideology that you get in like woke capitalist Netflix that just wants a very diversified, equitable, and inclusive capitalism, the ability for all minorities to be equally open in the process of rising up the social ladder. It's that same ethic that's very focused on individually grounded emancipation, as opposed to any collective project to overcome the conditions that one is in, which necessarily has to focus on the system. It's the same thing, but just with the socially conservative ethic. So there's this big reaction to him, but I see it very unoriginal. Like, I don't see anything original about it. It's just the same uh, essence, the same substance as wokeism, just from a socially conservative angle.
Right, exactly. There is nothing original about it, and like you said, it mirrors wokeism. He's got criticisms of the system, but they're always focused on the superstructure or the culture. Criticizing aspects of the culture, he'll never criticize the relations of production, which is why he's similar to Peterson. He'll criticize the culture and woke culture, but never criticize the relations of production. Just like liberals will criticize conservative culture and profess, or advocate for a more woke culture, but then they never criticize the relations of production or things like woke imperialism. So a lot of these themes are why I wanted to watch this video today, or why I thought it might be valuable.
Can we
As well,
just can, can we
yes, yeah,
just
go
go
ahead.
into this real quick before we
Yeah,
go?
yeah.
Because I don't think that everyone has seen our older videos on wokeism. Just to be clear, when we talk about wokeism, we're not doing it in the way that like Ron DeSantis does it. Our target is not minority groups or minority groups getting equal representation in media and films in Hollywood. We think that all that is fine and good. In Nicaragua and Cuba and other socialist countries, representation has been, they've tried to have as best equivalent representation of the population and in positions of governance and professionals and in the media and movies and stuff. So we don't criticize wokeism from that angle. We think about wokeism from the angle of how it is that capital at our specific stage of development is using these symbols, this rhetoric, the hashtags, the slogans of these movements that have come from, oppressed and marginalized groups in order to legitimize itself, both as capitalism at home through brands like Nike and different brands like that, but also through their imperialist activities by pointing out, how a specific country like China oppresses a Uyghur Muslim minority. They always emphasize the minority part, the Muslim part, so that it rings into the ears of the people that are sensible to these issues of minority groups, in such a way so that the manufacturing of consent, or what Parenti called the inventing of reality, is more susceptible to being done to people who are socially conscious about the inequalities that exist in society on the basis of race, gender, etc., nationality, religion. Another good example is Venezuela. They attack Venezuela for not being good on LGBTQ issues, or that sort of discourse that uses the symbols and all that stuff from these movements for minorities, marginalized, oppressed groups, and uses it for the ends of imperialism and for the ends of capitalism. And it paints liberation and emancipation for these groups as really just having a equal distribution of capitalists, diversifying the faces in high places, having, if 13% of the population is black, 13% of the billionaires be black, 13% of the people on mainstream media be black. That's what it paints as liberation. And we have to criticize that, because that is the ideology of the most dominant wing of capital right now, which is the liberal wing, which is the most successful in securing hegemony. If we want to engage in what Gramsci called a war of position, in a counter hegemonic form of politics, we have to critique, wokeism, and we understand it again as this phenomenon that arises out of the ideology that has recently developed from the liberal wing of empire.
It's the CIA recruitment ads that talk about how diverse and inclusive they are. There you go.
That's it, right?
What people think they are. There are people who think so surface level. The people inside the matrix think surface level. They sit there and think, this is only about accepting what gay people want to do. I don't care what gay people want to do. I'm not homophobic. I don't give a shit what you want to do. It's not about that. What's actually happening is that the New World Order and people who are in charge of the world are using certain agendas to enforce. They're using them as a disguise to enforce hidden things. You understand? It's like the Green New Deal. They come along and say, global warming, global warming, global warming. They pretend it's about the planet, but really it's about just raising taxes to the sky, locking you in your house and taking your car away. They don't give a shit about the planet. It's a disguise. So the people who are in charge of the world are using certain agendas, which they don't want you to argue against, to sneak in a bunch of other legislation, a bunch of other rules. And the whole pro-gay acceptance thing is exactly the same. It's nothing to do with gays. The people who are in charge of the world don't care about anyone but themselves. They don't care about you, whether you're gay or straight.
I will say it's interesting that, this is like a mainstream sort of position now, that there are just people on podcasts saying the world is run by a handful of people, and they don't care about your interests and they're trying to control you. Like, people do recognize that, that we're controlled by a small group of people protecting their own interests. But then you get, instead of them identifying that group of people as finance capitalists, as the most powerful industrial and banking capitalists in the country, groups that we were just talking about earlier this stream, they call it the New World Order, or some small cabal of certain people who are just pulling the strings because they can, because they have the power to do it. And they don't recognize that the matrix, as Andrew Tate calls it, is based on the capitalist relations of production. It's based on the contradiction within the commodity that we were also talking about earlier this stream. It's based on the exploitation of labor that it allows finance capitalists to accumulate until they control just about everything. It's because our system is, or because capitalism is commodity production in its most highly developed form, that we have all these issues, and that finance capitalists dominate our society. You don't need, as George Carlin says, you don't need a formal conspiracy when the interests of the capitalist class all align, right? It doesn't need to be a new world order. It's just finance capitalists trying to see their own interests. But it is interesting too that he says, because some of the times with these people that we call mirrors of wokeism, sometimes their criticisms of quote unquote wokeism or liberal ideology can be good. And one of the things he says here is like these finance capitalists, these people in charge of the world, don't actually care about LGBTQ people or about gay people. They don't actually care about these issues or the people that they affect. They're utilizing them as a tool to push for their own interests, right? Like the CIA diversity and inclusion commercials. They're using diversity and inclusion to try and get more people to join the CIA, get more smart people to join the CIA. Which of course works towards imperialist ends, works towards the ends that serve the interests of finance capital. So there are, a few grains of truth in what he says, but a lot of confusion and misconception. I would say the one thing that he misses or the main thing that he misses, of course, is that the matrix, the system that he's criticizing, is based upon the relations of production at its core, which are the relation between wage labor and capitalist. And there's various ways, like Andrew Tate recognizes that. Like, he tells people to get out of the 9 to 5. escape their alienation. There are various ways in which he sees it, but he doesn't see it. He thinks it's just some cabal of people called the New World Order running the system because they can.
Right. He was talking, and the way that I was thinking about it, it's that, an essential part of the matrix is to have people talk critically about the existing order as if it's a matrix, because few things are harder than, one, describing what the hell the matrix is, and two, thinking about overcoming it. You just talk about the matrix, or the existing order as a matrix, and you're like, shit, how do I escape the matrix? The mindset of escaping is bound to be individualistic, and the way that the existing order is conceptualized, when it's conceptualized as a matrix, it has this whole ahistorical dimension to it, where you forget that we're living under real systems that have developed from other systems that are kept up by agents being propped up to play a role in these systems. The capitalist as the personification of capital, etc. And that in the same way that it developed, it's undeveloping now. And that in the same way that it wasn't eternal and arose in history, it's also going to fall and give way to something new. But when you speak about it as a matrix, you take away history, you take away collective effort in overcoming and escaping the matrix. You escape the matrix in an individual fashion, right? Or in a very, particular fashion, right? Just think of Neo escaping the matrix. It's not him getting together with his coworkers and escaping the matrix. It's just him doing a few things, engaging with someone who has escaped it, and then boom. It's a very individualized process. And so I would say that in his critique of the matrix, he is playing a fundamental role for the perpetuation of the matrix in a state of the matrix where it is moribund, when it is failing, when it is undeveloping. And we need real critiques of the existing order, critiques grounded in the Marxist-Leninist understanding of imperialism and neo-imperialism. We don't need Andrew Tate. We don't need, discussions about the deep state and these evil people that are very far away and that handle everything, and we have no control and no way of changing things except by moving out into a cabin or getting super rich. He is, part of the matrix.
He thinks he's Neo, but he's actually one of Agent Smith's clones.
You keep doing this where I go on this long rant, and then you just distill the essence in like 2 seconds.
It's perfect.
Very jealous of that capacity.
Video will get taken down. But anyone who has a brain who wants to go and find out, you will find out that all this green agenda they're pushing has nothing to do with the environment. All this gay stuff they're pushing has nothing to do with gay people. It's all to do with control. People in charge of the world want more control. If they gave a shit about global warming and rising sea levels, why does every single multimillionaire and billionaire buy a house on the beach? The first place they buy their mansion. I thought we're all going to drown next year. Bollocks, bro. It's a lie. It's all a lie. They don't care. But by saying that, now there's carbon credits, carbon limits. You can't drive your car past 8 p.m. because of the environment. You can't eat meat anymore because of the environment. Stay home, eat the bugs, be a slave, be a slave, be a slave. Every single government in the world is interested in control. That's all they've ever wanted. That's all they ever want more of. Governments want control. They want to control their populace. They think of us as sheep. We're cattle to them. They want us to comply. They don't want our individuality. They don't want us to think for ourselves. They want us to just sit there and obey like robots. So every single one of them is slowly inching. Until they get away with the law. And that's what they're doing. And they're all inching towards communism, which is what they want in the end, because communism is the governmental system that allows them the most control over the world. People sit there and go, oh no, the governments don't want communism. The governments want free enterprise because governments want money and governments want everyone to be rich and they want people to be wealthy. This is beyond money. The people in charge of the world print the money. They don't care about money. They don't care about economies. They don't care about taxes. All these things are brokey considerations. When you print the money, do you think you give a shit if the economy is good or bad? You print the money. You don't.
Okay, I gotta stop that because that's pretty ridiculous. But this is what happens when you consider yourself a smart, intelligent person, and maybe you are because you're articulate, but then you don't believe in reading books. Like Andrew Tate says that you don't need books to be smart. You can just learn from life experience. this is what will happen if you don't read. Your ideas will just be all over the place, and you'll be spouting things off, but in a manner that's not really true. There are some things that he says are true, like it's all about control. I mean, he also says it's not about the money or not about the economy. Ultimately, money represents control. Money is the universal equivalent that can be exchanged for all products of labor, or it can be used to buy labor power itself. So the more money you have, the more control you have over labor, other people's labor, and the products of other people's labor. So money, in being the universal equivalent and the mediator of exchange in capitalist society, does equal control. It equals control of other people's activity, control of other people's labor. And I mean, I'll let you jump in quick. I have a whole lot more to say, Carlos, and got to respond to a handful of the other things he said. But if you have anything to say about that, you can go ahead.
But he's just a sophist. That's all it is. It's, and being articulate is not intelligence. These ancient Greek school of philosophy, I don't know if you can even call it philosophy, but we do, which were the sophists. And, that's where we get the word sophistry. And they would go around charging people to teach them how to make, how to be really good rhetoricians, how to talk in a very articulate way that can convince people. And there was this one sophist by the name of Gorgias who would say, you take me into a town with a doctor, and I would convince people in that town that I would be better suited to be the town's doctor than the actual doctor, even if I know nothing about medicine. And that's what these people are. They're just really articulate. They're dressed nice. They have, good, good cameras, good visuals, good angles, whatever, good producers, and they convince a shitload of people, right? But when you look at the substance of their arguments, it's empty. There's nothing there. It's governments are all the same. Control. That's a very stupid claim. It's a very abstract way of speaking about government, because the government is but a specific form that the first of all, he's talking about the state, really, but the state arises because there's contradictions between classes in civil society that cannot be contained by civil society itself. And so one class, the dominant economic class in civil society, props up the state, buys off a part of the other class to protect it. Those are the armed bodies of men. And, a state functions in that way. It defends the interests of the dominant class. And the dominant class changes with developments in history. During the slave democracies of ancient Athens, you had a state that functioned in a qualitatively different form than in the Roman republics, which came after that. And those function in a qualitatively different form than the feudal aristocracies, which came, centuries after that. And those feudal aristocracies function in a qualitatively different form than the liberal democratic bourgeois states, which arise, a few hundred years after that with the development of capitalism. And those states in the early development of capitalism function in a qualitatively or partial qualitatively different form than those states today, when we are at the most advanced stage of capitalist neo-imperialism, when the system is already degenerating and in its most moribund possible stage. So there's no such thing as a state or a government in the abstract. It's always a government that serves the interests of a particular class. And when you have a socialist government, you're talking about a government that serves the interests of the vast majority of people. Another way to talk about that is just through the word democracy, right? What does democracy mean? Demos and kratos. Demos means common people. Kratos means power. Power is in the hands of the common people. And what is socialism formulated as within Marxism? Dictatorship of the proletariat. In other places, it's dictatorship of the peasantry and the proletariat, or an all people's dictatorship or democratic dictatorship, And what does that mean? That power is in the hands of the common people, the working masses, the peasant class and other popular classes. Sometimes they add the petty bourgeoisie and small business owners in there, so government is an abstract word, government. What type of government is the real question, because when you answer the question of what type of government, then, you are describing essential differences in how those governments function. You know, the government today functions, yeah, to control, but to control for the sake of a very small group of people, being able to accumulate as much capital as possible. A socialist government wouldn't function like that. They would control, but control for the sake of lifting the living standards of the vast majority of people and ensuring for everyone the best conditions for collective flourishing. So it's just you know, really dumb, superficial, empty, abstract, rhetorical, sophistic talking points that he has.
Yeah, and what he identifies as increased government control is just increased dictatorship of capital and the degree of suppression of that capitalist class of the masses. Whether it's things like the Patriot Act, allowing the government to spy on people and see their cell phones, the formation and increasing powers of the NSA, National Security Agency. You have them prosecuting Julian Assange right now, or trying to prosecute him under the Espionage Act, you know, which doesn't allow him to bring up a public defense trial, say that I leaked this information in the interest of public good. So basically, it's just a way for the government to toss him in jail. This is all increasing the government's its control by capital and its suppression of the working masses for capital. And the suppression of anything that might lead the working masses to rise up against capitalism and imperialism. So like you said, it's not just government control in the abstract. You know, that doesn't mean anything. There are different ways in which the government is increasing its degree of suppression, but it's within a specific context, and it's at the behest of a specific class aimed at the suppression of another specific class or classes. And then he talks about how governments are making everyone poor, and governments, you know, just want everyone to eat bugs and stuff because of the way that the direction that the U.S. economic system is going. But if you look at what China's doing, they've recently abolished extreme poverty, right? They're doing the opposite. They're developing productive industry not only in their own country, but through the Belt and Road Initiative all around the world. They want the people to have more. They want to industrialize, to have more production, more of an economic productive base, not only in their country, but among their trading partners in the global South, in areas where the U.S. financial oligarchy is prevented from developing for years. So it's the opposite of what Andrew Tate accuses governments of doing, because it's a government that serves a different class, which is why you can't just look at governments in the abstract. Maybe they're increasing their control of production, right? And whereas the U.S. Government is increasing their control of working people and of information. But, you know, those are very different kinds of control. And you have to look at what each particular government is doing, which of course is not what Andrew Tate's doing. He doesn't read books. He tells people not to read books. So, I mean, if that isn't an example of a sophist, I don't know what is. But my dad, who's not a philosopher for sure, but he's a teacher, and, you know, he's pretty smart about certain things. He would tell me growing up, if you say anything confidently over and over and over again, there's a certain number of people who will believe you and follow you. And I think that Andrew Tate proves that pretty perfectly.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just look at, like, any cult is saying pretty absurd shit, but somehow there's a group of people around the leading figure that have heard it enough so that the absurd shit starts to make sense with time and with repetition. There's this old Latin saying that repetitio est mater studiorum, which is repetition is the mother of all knowledge. It's also the mother of all confusion and of all, you know, wrong knowledge, because you have this guy repeated to you a million times over on TikTok over 3 months, and then you start to treat what he's saying as knowledge, and it never got to the point of being knowledge. It was always just, you know, sophistic opinions.
Absolutely. I think we can finish this video and then we can hit on the last few points I had written down to talk about.
You care. What you care about is when you click your fingers, do people obey you? That's what they want. They want power.
Oh, yeah.
That's what it's really about. The whole world is about power. So when someone comes on TV and tells me I'm supposed to believe something, you need to believe this about the planet. You need to believe this about the gays. You need to believe this about this virus. You need to believe this. I sit there and I look at it and go, why do you want me to believe this?
Do you think? Yeah.
Why? It's a lot. And sorry, you got started now. Sorry, bro. And sorry, you got started now. Sorry, bro. But it's like, why do you want me to believe this? Do you want me to believe this because it's good for me, or is it because it's good for you? Are the rules made for the benefit of me, or are they made for the benefit of the people who make the rules? And you sit there and you understand that all of it is programming. All of it is a lie. They want you to believe things that are not true, like go to university, get in debt, sit there, learn or get a degree. But they want you to believe all this crap so that you are as enslaved as they can make you. This is all they want. And I understand that. So whenever they come along with anything, this is not about gay people as a whole.
For someone who talks about winning and like getting your own way and the drive, the reality is that his constant complaining just means that he lost as a capitalist. If he would have won, if he would have been one of the big guys, he wouldn't have been complaining about the government, because he would have been in the pocket of every politician. His money would have been in the pocket of every politician. If he would have been actually a winner for his social class, it means that he would have developed enough capital to influence government to not have to talk the shit that he talks online. The fact that he does that, he's just complaining. He's just complaining because he lost as a capitalist. He hasn't gotten to the stage of a super monopoly capitalist that can influence governance at both a national and international scale. He's a failure.
He's a high-end lumpen proletariat. He's someone who's a black market capitalist. He's somebody who engages in illicit activities like sex trafficking in order to get a large amount of money compared to the average working class person, which he then flexes on working class people and complains about the fact that he's not in the financial oligarchy, like you said. And I mean, there are interesting things there, like the fact that he says, anytime I see something on TV or on the media, I ask, is this in my interest or yours? That is a good question to ask, whose interest is this in with everything that you consume? But of course, it's in the interest of not the New World Order, some abstract group of evil governments that Andrew Tate imagined in his mind. It's the interest of a particular class, the class of finance capitalists who control every aspect of production, including the production of information, so that information down to our entertainment media, not just our news, is going to be influenced and shaped by the capitalist relations of production and by the capitalist class and their interests. But of course, you have to concretize this. You have to ask what class actually controls production and is producing information that serves their interests. And it's not just this new world order of governments coming together. And I mean, look at the conflicts between governments going on globally right now. If all of the governments' interests were in the same and they're all just trying to push us towards communism, would there be a war in Ukraine? Would the U.S. and their allies under NATO be lining up and arming up against China and Russia? Of course not. There are governments with different interests, and the governments who, ironically, China and some governments who do want to move towards communism are the ones who don't want the masses to be poor, who are trying to give the masses, control of their own economy, of their own society, and of their own destiny, of their own time, and not have them be alienated cogs in this machine. But then, Tate, of course, because he's just doing sophistry and just looking at things in an idealist, non-concrete way, just says it's all the governments, working against us to build communism, which just makes no sense. And and then the last thing he says, it's not about these people just want control. They don't care about money. They can print the money. They don't care about economies. That part's like the most wrong thing he said, like objectively wrong. First, I mean, like I said, money is a representation of labor value. It allows you to control labor value. So there's always a certain amount of labor value in total, you know, a certain amount of social necessary labor, and then a certain amount of social labor, but a quantitative amount of labor time that's expended, say, annually. And then money is a representation of that labor time, the products of that labor. And, you know, you can use money to set labor in motion to control living labor itself. So ultimately, money is a mediator of exchange with products of labor and something that controls labor. But if you just print a bunch of money, you know, that's just going to mean there's, for every, say, 1 minute of labor, it's going to be represented by more units of money, right? So you can print a bunch of units of money. It's just going to make that money less valuable in controlling labor eventually. So you can't just print money. And I mean, this is something, this was almost a meme a while back where people were saying, why don't we just print more money to fix the economy? I believe that was a meme that was going around on TikTok. But from a Marxist perspective, there's reasons that you can't fix capitalism. It's because all the contradictions stem from the relations of production, from the contradiction within the commodity form. You can't just print off a bunch of money and somehow fix all these issues. And then the idea that people don't care, or I mean, the finance capitalists running the world don't care about economies is, I mean, ridiculous. I don't even know where to start with that one. What they're trying to do is maintain capitalist relations of production, stop people who are discontented with the system from actually seeing the root causes of the system's problems, which is something that Andrew Tate helps to do, actually, which is why, as we said, he's part of the matrix. He helps enforce the matrix. He helps keep the system going, helps keep the relations of production intact. But also, if you look at, like, anytime a government starts moving towards socialism, or even if they start nationalizing a few resources, like with Guatemala, the first U.S. coup, or the second U.S. coup after World War II, they were taking land that belonged to the United Fruit Company that they weren't even using, that the company wasn't even using productively, and trying to give that land back to the people, trying to nationalize that land and have it be publicly owned. And the U.S. did a coup, and Jacobo Arbenz, the leader who tried to do it, was found boiled to death in a bathtub. So the idea that the people running the world don't care about economies is absurd. Anytime, you know, an economy starts to move even a fraction away from unbridled neoliberal capitalism, then the capitalist class, the ruling financial oligarchy in the West, freaks out and does everything they can to destroy that society or undercut their attempt to build something different with different relations of production at the core.
I guess maybe we could also touch on his comments on, you know, on environmentalism as this agenda just to keep everyone poor. And, you know, that might be the case in some of the most powerful of the transnational capitalist class. You know, more and more of their ideologues come out saying that we don't need this many people on the planet, and you know, very much pushing an agenda of degrowth for everyone else but them. And there is, again, some truth to that, but that shouldn't take you to the position which he goes to, which is that, okay, the thing that they're labeling as climate change is fake. Because there's other countries that are dealing with it in a much different manner. And I think it's really a failure of dialectical thinking. Not a failure of dialectical thinking, but an absence of dialectical thinking to hold that, you know, you either tackle the climate crisis or you grow productively. There is such a thing as sustainable development. It's a unity of productive growth and doing so in a form that's environmentally efficient and environmentally sustainable. And you know, countries like China are doing it. Cuba's doing it to the extent that it's allowed to because of the blockade. But you know, China's the leading country in environmental efforts. But it's also at the same time the country that's growing the quickest, and their growth is not based on speculative, financialized capital as ours is in the U.S. It's real growth. You know, new cities popping up left and right. old cities developing into, cities that make New York look like, just trash. I don't know what to say it. So it's in China you have the reality that you can both function in an environment in a manner which, as they call it, has productive social growth in harmony. They use the word harmony in the Constitution and the CPC, in harmony with nature, which Marx uses the word in a rational metabolism with nature. But you can have both. You can have productive growth and environmental, and have that growth be in an environmental manner. So, he's I guess trying to separate that, and I think there's people today in the left that do that think it's either or, but that's not the case. China's the archetype of showing to the world that that's not the case. You can have both growth and sustainability.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna come at his comments on the environment from a little bit of a different angle. It's interesting to hear you say it. It's been interesting to hear your comments on this video in general, because I had watched it previously and kind of had an idea of what I wanted to say, and you brought up some different things that I didn't think of. Obviously, there's been some overlap, but that's pretty cool. But I think he recognizes these things like the Green New Deal, which a lot of times are professed by like liberals in Congress, or like people at the World Economic Forum, who don't really care about the environment, of course, or don't really care about the masses, but they pitch these plans that are, not to say this is necessarily the Green New Deal. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but a lot of times they'll push these plans that are at their core serve bourgeois interests, but have the mask or the disguise of serving social good. So it'll be, tax cuts for some green corporation, as long as they move towards renewables like 2%, they'll get a big tax write-off or whatever. And it's really, a bourgeois funded or a bourgeois crafted policy disguised as being to prevent climate change. And in reality, it's doing almost nothing to prevent climate change, and leading to more surplus value accumulation for the bourgeoisie. So a lot of times people identify those greenwashing. Yeah. I think Tate and his followers identify things like that. They'll be like, well, these people pushing the Green New Deal are lying to us. Okay, maybe some of them are, maybe the core of them are. But does that mean climate change isn't real? Let's look at the science of it. But of course, we're talking about Andrew Tate here, who says not to read books because they won't teach you anything. So I don't think he's going to look at the science of it. But yeah, I like that you called it sophistry, because that really is the best word. That's the word that keeps coming in my head when I think about what he is, just a sophist and a fraud. Would you call Jordan Peterson a sophist as well, or does the label not apply? I don't know if you watched my recent hour-long video about him, but
yeah, I'd call it sophistry. Really, sophistry, when it comes down to it, is an absence of substance because of the prioritizing of form, right? So it's when people are extremely articulate, extremely convincing, but when you have the capacity to get to the meat and bones of their argument, you realize that it's really, it's a house of cards. It's a very empty argument, not very well formulated, but just, the vessel that the argument takes is what really allows it to be disseminated so broadly. So yeah, I would definitely say that Jordan Peterson is a very, very successful sophist who has taken sophistry beyond just, the patterns of discourse, but it's not just in the argumentation. It's like he'll cry. He cries all the time for someone, promoting manliness in this very machista form. He's constantly crying, which is a little weird, and for very for things that you wouldn't cry about. But that's a part of the shtick. That's a part of the sophist's shtick. Also, the way he dresses, it just gives him an aura of authority that plays into the discursive and rhetorical practices that encapsulate his sophistry. So yeah, absolutely. A lot with the bourgeoisie, and I'm just getting into, as I mentioned, a few hundred pages into The Destruction of Reason. And, there's a very interesting argument that Lukács makes, which is that in France, after the 1830 revolution attempts, and in the rest of Europe after 1848, with the failed revolutions, which are, of course, are the occasion for which Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. After that point, it's very clear that the bourgeoisie, it's no longer a progressive class. It's no longer that class which is at the forefront of the fight against feudal aristocracies. It has become quite explicitly, a conservative force, a force that's no longer progressive. It's no longer radical in the sense its movement and advancement is getting at the root of society and changing it. It was doing that under feudalism. It's not doing that anymore in an order in which it has become the dominant class. And so the point that Lukács makes is that after 1848, if bourgeois philosophy is going to be serious and actually engage with reality, it has to become socialist. It has to adopt the proletarian outlook, which is a similar point that Marx makes in the first preface to Capital, where he says that after capitalism developed to a specific point, you just cannot have a bourgeois political economic science. It stops achieving the level of a science after a certain point in the development of capital, if they continue to align themselves with the bourgeoisie. In order for it to be a science again, they have to align themselves with the proletariat. And that's a similar point that Lukács is making. In 1952, after the Second World War, he sees that what you have had in philosophy are various forms of irrationalism, because in order to not accept socialism, which is the natural conclusion when you have a rational, concrete, dialectical study of reality, in order to not accept socialism, they have to fall into irrationalism. And so there you have Nietzsche. There you have the various, Italian fascists that lead to National Socialism. There you have the various currents in the 20th century, in political economy, and neoclassical economics. There you have postmodernism, right? Post-structural, all these different tendencies of bourgeois philosophy, which try to go back to usually philosophers before Marx. There's that famous Sartre quote where every attempt at attacking on Marx's argument is really going back to a point before Marx that Marx had already superseded, right? They're all just doing that. And in the act of doing that, they fail to connect with reality in any meaningful way and are just all embedded in irrationalism. It's all irrational philosophy. And in these demagogues that you have, like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, these pseudo-intellectuals, you have that irrationalism, that irrationalist worldview in its less coherent, in its lowest form.
Yeah, that's super interesting. You should, or I got to read some of the things where Lukács is talking about that, because it's something I found to be true not only in my studies of political economy, but healthcare administration as well, where like the entire field is basically, at least as far as solutions go, solutions for the system's problems are completely empty. Because they're created by corporations or people working for the corporations who dominate the system. And unless you call for the liquidation of those corporations, which people rarely do in the field, then you're not doing what you should. I mean, that's the only way to solve all of the problems and all of the contradictions in the system, is to make it public, make it not based on commodity production, make it not for profit. And one of the most interesting things that I found in healthcare administration, because now there are a lot of good criticisms in the field of healthcare administration published of the healthcare system, right? And there's a lot of good material analyses of the system. It's just their solutions for fixing it are always reformist and not realistic and don't get to the root of the problem. But one of the interesting things is there's this huge concept in healthcare administration right now, a huge thing in the field, where they are trying to move from fee-for-service based payment models to value-based payment models. Now, what does that mean? Fee for service is the more volume of healthcare you sell, the more healthcare you sell at the higher price, the more profit you make, the more money you get back. And therefore, that's good. And the motivating drive then is to sell as much healthcare as possible. And that's been the current that's the current model, and that's been the model since the American healthcare system became a thing. Ever since there was a capitalist healthcare system. But value-based, what they're trying to move towards in order to move away from fee-for-service is just healthcare based on health outcomes, right? The idea is that every provider would be given a certain population of people, patients, and then they would be in charge of meeting those patients' needs. Not only that, but it would focus on preventative care and what brings the patients the best health outcomes rather than profit. Now, there's another idea that somebody will then pay these providers based on how well they keep their patients healthy, but they can't enact this model. So they have literally a socialistic model of healthcare based on use values, down to like they know how they would actually manage it and organize it, right? Providers would be in charge of their certain populations, and every single person then in the community would be covered. But the question that they always ask and that we have to write about all the time is, how do we move from fee-for-service to value-based? How do we move from a payment model based on selling as much healthcare as we can to make as much money as we possibly can to a payment model based on meeting people's needs with use values? It's like, well, you freaking can't. You can't, because all the companies, the people controlling all the major functions in healthcare, like I said in my Journal of American Socialist article, are profit-based. And even the nonprofit hospitals are still operating within the market system. So they're largely raking in money hand over fist too, which they give to corporate executives and working together with for-profit companies to game and control the market. So until you make the system public, until you get rid of these corporations, until you change the basis of the system, and make it publicly owned rather than based on this relation between wage labor and capital, you're not going to move to value-based healthcare. It's impossible. So it's just hilarious that the field of study has created, has recognized what they need to do. They just can't figure out how to do it because they don't recognize that it's a socialist model that they actually want to move towards.
And that's irrationalism. By the way, thank you to the Politism. Love you guys' work. Thanks for helping. Thanks for helping keep me sane at my job. Our pleasure, comrade. Yeah, and to tie it back to irrationalism, that whole phenomenon which you're talking about is a form of irrationalism. Like you started talking and an image came to mind. You have a house that's on fire because there was a gas leak, right? The whole house is on fire. And then you have these people outside trying to understand why there's this crisis going on, why this house is on fire. And they're all pointing at very stupid things. One of them said, it's because someone lit a match, but there wasn't anyone in the house, but they still want to hold that someone lit a match, And another one said that, there was a candle that was on and the candle jumped. Somehow the fire jumped and then it got into this other thing, it got into the wood, and that's why so none of them are really able to get to the root, right? It's the same thing as, how they diagnose the very observable and clear and unavoidable problems that we have in our society today. But then there's some that get at the root of it and say, it's the gas leak. It led to everything else. And, that's like the ones that you said, the problem is the fee for charge method. We need to move to this other method. And then what do they give for the solution? They say, well, let's put out the fire by throwing gasoline on it. Gasoline's going to put out the fire, really. So when you think about it, in every step of the way, whether in diagnosing the problem or even if you get close to getting truth when you diagnose it and thinking about the solution, you have irrationalism. Because it's very easy, once you are not biased against a proletarian socialist outlook, it's very easy to come to the conclusion through a rational cognitive operation that socialism is the only answer. And insofar as you try to avoid that being the only answer, you're bound to land yourself and your analysis in a form of irrationalism. And that's all we've ever had from the bourgeois ideologues since 1848.
Huh. That's really interesting. I never thought of it that way, but you're 100% correct. And there's so many studies that I love of the healthcare system, or analyses that I love that are so good and detailing all these things that are so true. And I can tell that the research that went into it was thorough and, took time and is so valuable. Like there's one in particular I'm thinking of that details the opioid crisis and corporate influence. But then the solutions they come to at the end are like, let's just try and build a wall between government and the private sector. Even though they explain in that article that the basis of American healthcare has been private-public collaboration since the very beginning. Collaboration by public and government-owned entities to try and maximize profit for the private sector. Of course, we've always had a dictatorship of capital. That's been the state of our state apparatus since the inception of capitalism. So then how are you just going to, now in modern day, build a wall between the two, get the government away from healthcare when they're deeply intertwined in the systems our systems of healthcare have been deeply intertwined and developed that way for years and years and years. And you have analysts who can recognize this, but then, their solutions are just, I'm not allowed to say socialism. I'm not allowed to say seize the entire thing from the shareholders and make it public. So we'll just encourage, less collaboration between the government and the private sector. Like, oh yeah, that'll stop them.
Absolutely. And do they say that they're going to get the Mexicans to build the wall, or is that just the other discussion about the wall?
Yes, they
Anytime
actually
the
say
wall,
that China will build it.
China will build the wall.
Yep.
Okay.
The
chat's having a discussion about Scarface, and Scarface is one of those guilty pleasures that I have, that I continue to greatly enjoy, even though ideologically I should be critiquing it. I can't help but just enjoy it. Damn it, Paul, we're going to get to your question right now without you having to donate that, but thank you very much. That helps. I literally had it starred so that we can answer it now. But what can Marxists do to have a popular appeal at the level similar to Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson? Now, that's the $1 million question right there.
Oh, that's what I was going to say earlier. Thank you, Paul. Remember when I forgot what I was going to say?
Yeah.
Tate? I remember now. All right, you go ahead, though, Carlos.
Well, I think it's a complicated answer because although that these people claim to have the algorithms against them, and maybe for Tate that's more true than for Peterson, the reality is that the mediums, and I like to think of them as ideological fields. That's how Gramsci used to think about the superstructure, various superstructural fields. The superstructural fields that the vast majority of people engage with today, when they're on social media and when they're on the internet, they're controlled by capitalists, which means that your accounts, if you start to get popular, can have the rug pulled under them, 7 times, random number. I don't know where I got it from. Some accounts get banned 7 times in a row, but that, not only can that happen, but as I was talking to Noah the other day, but even if you say, like, if you create your own communist Twitter or something, or a free speech Twitter, people are going to find that, if anyone finds it at all, they're going to have to find that through the search engines that are owned by the same Silicon Valley monopolist as those who own the social media accounts. If you want to make it into an app, you're going to have to convince Google and Apple to allow you to make it into an app, and they're not going to, make it in. So there's such a monopoly and centralized control over all of these operations, and the vast majority of people are there, that it makes it extremely difficult to have that popular appeal that Andrew Tate and Peterson have, because anytime we get anywhere close to it, because we actually represent the threat to the existing order, we can be so easily removed. So I think that the way that we achieve that popularity is going to have to be on the ground, talking to people. That doesn't mean that we can't engage with these mediums. We have to engage with them. You have to engage with them today, just as a necessary course in the war of positions and engaging in this ideological warfare in various superstructural fields. You have to do it. But our creme de la creme, our real important work is going to be on the ground, in the workshops, in people's communities, because that's where they can't really censor you. I mean, they can fire you, they can do different things to you. They can, you know, if you're very successful, they can kill you, they can deport you, they can do different things, but they can't eliminate you as easily as they can on social media.
Yeah, it's been kind of crazy to see how easy it is for them, because I mean, we'd probably have 1 million followers right now on TikTok. Our first account they banned at 370,000. They just wiped it out. And I know all the people that I know were like, wait, what? You know, like they're allowed to do that. I'm like, yeah. And there were a lot of people who were naive, who I had told before, you know, I'm going to get banned, or there are going to be people who come for my employment. And they're like, oh, yeah, I'm sure. They didn't realize it because they, you know, when I talk politics with them, they know maybe I'm farther left than them, but they just think what I say is pretty rational. So then they don't understand why I would be banned for saying that kind of stuff. And a lot of people have been shocked. And I think it shows them how authoritarian our system really is, for lack of a better word. But the thing I was going to say earlier had to do with combating people like Andrew Tate, combating these bourgeois ideologues, which is what I've been trying to do recently with this series, responding to Peterson's video about communism and now Tate's video about communism. First of all, bringing their arguments, bringing out the substance of their argument so that you can knock them down. Right? Let's distill what they're actually saying here, and then let's provide a counter, explain what's actually going on. So you search for the substance within their argument by steel manning them, right? Not just dismissing everything they say. You say, okay, let me listen to what they're saying and try and actually pinpoint what's true, and then deconstruct what's wrong and where their analysis went astray, like we just did with Andrew Tate. That's one way to do it. But then also, I think we need to do this by bringing more people into the movement, more people into the struggle, but also trying to, you know, like I said, trying to be virtuous people in our own lives, in our personal lives, in our individual life, so that, you know, the only people that young kids have to turn to when they're trying to develop themselves and find who they are, aren't people like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, right? That communists are upstanding, virtuous people involved in their communities, people who are concerned with developing themselves and being a reliable and good person, so that we can be role models for the youth, really. This is something I really believe. It might sound a little bit corny, but there's a reason the youth are turning to figures like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, or they think that that's, you know, that those are the icons of masculinity. And we need to show people that you can, you know, you can achieve things in combat sports like Andrew Tate and be a communist, right? You can develop yourself and be great in your field, and have, you know, goals and intentions of becoming great at something and still be a communist. You can clean your room and be a responsible person like Peterson tells you, but then also analyze the system and criticize the system, so you don't end up being a dope for the ruling capitalist class like he is. But, you know, in order to be that, you do have to have a real structural analysis of the system. Otherwise, you'll get lost in the matrix like Andrew Tate is, just punching at the air in the New World Order or whatever. So I think we need to provide an alternative to these people. And that's a huge thing that we try and do. Ultimately, like Carlos said, it's getting helping to form workers' combinations on the ground, helping to do that grassroots work. Community and workplace organizing is going to be the key. But, you know, I've seen some people say in the chat, or I see it every single time we respond to someone like Andrew Tate. They'll be like, why are you even wasting your time with this guy? Why even bother with this guy? But then the video will have 10,000 views and will gain 200 subscribers for it, from it. You know, like, you have to go to where people are at. And right now, a lot of people online, a lot of young people are watching Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, which is why those videos get a lot of views. People are genuinely interested in seeing somebody combat their arguments in an honest way. So, you know, I think it is important to engage with the mainstream or the most prominent thinkers of our age, because there are people being influenced by those thinkers, especially in the technological era where you can just shoot messages. Anybody can shoot messages out over the internet and through social media. So yeah, that's probably a long response, but it reminded me of what I was going to say earlier. So thank you, Paul, and thanks for the super chat as well.
It was a really good response, and I just forgot what I was just going to reply to that most immediately. But we wrote an article at the end of the 50th anniversary of Che's murder for the International magazine, which was titled "Pioneers for Communism Strive to Be Like Che," and that's the slogan that Cuban school kids have to say like every morning before. It's like the slogan for the school kids in Cuba, because they realize that it's so important to have these figures that embody virtue from the standard of the communists, right? And that kids can strive to emulate, these figures that, kids grow up seeing them as heroes, and that they feel like they should emulate them. In China, they're developing what they're calling a communist virtue ethic, right? It's almost like taking Aristotle's virtue ethic and making it communist, that realizing that, something that's very fundamental in being able to flourish in life. It's not just having the material necessities covered, but also participating in virtue. And that means something very distinctly as a communist. And I always think about the concept of Gramsci, ethical political transformation. I think that's such an important way to think about things, because it gets at the root of how it is that Marxists view the individual. For Marx, the individual is a unique expression of the ensemble of social relations they are embedded in, which means that when the individual undergoes a ethical transformation, it's not separated from a transformation of those around them. Every time you have an ethical transformation and you develop, communist virtue ethic, you're influencing those around you, which means that every ethical transformation is simultaneously an ethical political transformation. You're getting a transformation in the police out of your ethical individual transformation, and the same way the other way around. The changes in the police and in politics lead to changes at the individual ethical level. And we have this tendency to think that when you reduce things to individual activity, and you're engaged in this form of liberal moralism that like tries to reduce the problem with climate change, so like individuals eating habits or recycling habits or whatever, and that is wrong, because those are reducing systemic problems to problems of individuals, and that's incorrect. But it's not the case that any approach to transforming the existing state of affairs, which has a role for individual transformation, is necessarily going to be reduced to that role that the individual that the liberals prioritize in their very individualist format. For Marxists, an ethical transformation is always necessary, especially in those who see themselves as the vanguard, which all it really means is the people who can direct in an organized and ideologically coherent fashion the mass of people into a new world. And for that, you need to, in a way, embody the goal that you're striving towards. If you want to convince people about the about communism and about fighting for it, you cannot be someone who's riddled in vices, someone who instead of naturally people looking up to, they look down to. You should be the sort of person where people look up to. Che used to say that you should strive, there you go, you should strive to be
Good timing there.
Really good timing. You should strive to be in the classroom the best student. Strive to be the best student, not by digging others down, not by, if you have a test and a colleague asks you a question about a specific theme, you tell them the opposite so they can get it wrong and you can be the best. No, you help others, you help bring them up, but you still strive to be the best. And that's how he thinks about the vanguard. And I think that ethic would be a really good antidote to this very cheap individualist and really just money hungry, grounded in the American assumption form of virtue, go get it ethic that's pronounced by Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate.
And I see it with my wrestling athletes every day. Like, they don't necessarily want to embrace this selfish just step on everybody's throat and be the best, like sort of old school mentality that a lot of athletes are fed. Like kids these days, at least in my experience in wrestling, are way more prone to more Che style arguments. Actually, one of my athletes has my Che Guevara biography right now because I gave it to him to read. This, I am going to be a good person in my community and, an upstanding, virtuous person in my personal life, or I'm going to, I'm going to clean my room and care about the world around me. Whereas Jordan Peterson says, just clean your room and, do what you can to boost yourself. And I thought this was an interesting comment. Someone says, I disagree, Eddie. Neither Peterson nor Tate are virtuous by any measure. They are just successful. Virtue is not what is attractive about them, I think. Peterson definitely professes virtue. I don't know what he does in his personal life, but he definitely professes the ideal of being virtuous and tells his big thing is that you should have virtues which you aspire to live up to in your life. And that's one of the, the self-help things that I actually do find value in as far as Peterson. But with Tate, I agree he's not virtuous. Maybe sometimes he holds up the ideals of virtue the same way Peterson does, as he's engaging in sex trafficking behind the scenes. But I meant more successful with him. Like communists are allowed to be successful in their field or in their sport. The same way, because Andrew Tate is a successful kickboxer. He is good at combat sports, and that is what a lot of people are attracted to about him. That's what a lot of people like about him. And obviously, selfishly, that's relevant for me because I'm involved with combat sports, but not selfishly, like the popularity of communism among wrestlers has shot through the roof since, and I'm not taking full credit for it. Part of it's just the changing material conditions, but there used to be, you weren't a communist if you were a wrestler, you were a Republican, you're right wing, and it'd be very rare that you would find liberal wrestlers. Now you have all these wrestlers like reading theory. Last week, again, somebody came up to me at the wrestling tournament I was at and was like, "Are you Midwestern Marx?" and literally gave me a hug because they loved our content so much. That's happened at every single competition this year. Every single tournament, someone's done that. So, by providing combat sports athletes an alternative, by saying you can be a successful wrestler, you can be, tough and, want to fight and be great at what you do as an individual, and still be a communist who wants to change the relations of production and make society better and allow everyone to flourish. Because, and I can even relate it to wrestling with seeing people have to quit because they have to, when they're like 16, because they have to work a job to put food on the table for their family and stuff. You can relate it to that. So that's more what I'm saying is there are things that make people like Andrew Tate attractive to young kids. And it's that he's big, he's built, and he's successful at combat sports. They think he's a badass, right? If you want to consider being a badass a virtue or not, we could argue that, but we can have communist badasses who counter the Andrew Tate narrative and counter not just the narrative, but the aesthetic in various ways. And obviously we don't want to co-opt the parts of his aesthetic that suck, the misogyny and whatnot. But we do want to offer people an alternative and not just be like, oh, the conservatives, the right wingers are tough guys who are misogynistic like Andrew Tate. Well, we can't be tough then. We can't do combat sports either. That's a right wing thing. We have to provide an alternative. And yeah.
Especially in this age of like universal despair from people, what rings and attracts a lot of these folks struggling in their everyday life to Jordan Peterson's and Andrew Tate is that they're telling them, they're kind of pumping them up and telling them that they should have a purpose in life and that they can do something, they can change. The change that they envision is far from being correct and far from being the solution. And the way they formulate why they are in despair is far from, getting at the real root of the question. But someone here mentioned a really good comment, which is that if taking care of your family is manly, why would taking care of your community be less manly? But Eddie, you mentioned that you didn't know about Jordan Peterson's life. So I got this picture here. He clearly does not clean his room. It reminds me of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer used to say that I have preached sainthood, but I myself am no saint. And Peterson has definitely preached cleaning rooms, but he has himself not cleaned his room.
That's sad to see. That's devastating. I mean, that picture had to be heartbreaking for Peterson's followers, you know. Like, you see his room, it's not even clean. Like, what have I even been doing with my life? That's like the principle I based my whole life upon. He's also, and not to, I mean, this is horrible, and I've written extensively about the opioid crisis and how terrible it is and how to combat it, but he was addicted to opioids during the height of his, you know, rise to fame. And I think he's since kicked them while picking up like the carnivore diet or something. But and in a lot of pictures, he doesn't look that healthy. Like the one you showed me didn't look that healthy. But yeah, it's interesting that, because I wouldn't normally bring that up, you know, that someone was struggling with addiction like that, because it's sad and it's a health issue. But he's so arrogant. Right? He's so confident, and he acts like, I'm this guy who's got it all figured out. Do what I do what I tell you, and you can be great like me. You can be virtuous like me. And meanwhile, he's leaning on the same, you know, pills and addictions and vices that, you know, the majority of working class Americans are leaning on. And yeah. He went to Russia for his healthcare for his addiction. I didn't even know that. Oh, I did hear that. I knew he left the country. I didn't know it was Russia, though. That's hilarious.
I didn't know that either. But yeah, I mean, I think that all feeds into the irrationality of their thought, because when they, in their life, and I guess this is more true for Peterson now, when they experience at the level of opioid addiction, at the level of the sort of distress that society imbues on him to the point of him not cleaning his room or something, I don't know. But when you experience those contradictions in your own life and you still reject, you know, any critical assessment of the existing order for your very irrationalist worldview, what you're committing yourself is to a way of approaching the world that's completely devoid of reason.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like, I think there's some grains of truth in Peterson's self-help, like I said, and I know people who it's helped, but the people who I know who it's helped have also become communists, and then begun to critique the world around them. So
that's the 13th step that he leaves out.
Yes. The 13th step is read Marx, not just the Communist Manifesto like he did.
Right.
And then re-debate Zizek and destroy him from the left, critique him from a place of orthodox Marxism. That'll be Jordan Peterson's next big accomplishment. Do you want to cover this Bernie video quick before we call it, or are you tuckered out today?
Yeah, we can cover it. I don't think it would take too much time.
Yeah, it should be a quick one. It's just a video. I mean, I responded to this video. I guess I could show my tweet in response to it too, as well as the video itself. But basically, Bernie, once again, giving tentative support, but support nonetheless for the war in Ukraine, which, I mean, this is what we've come to expect at this point. It's just, you wish that he'd at least throw out some like tepid criticism, a little bit of resistance, but there's essentially none, you know. And here's my tweet in response. 2023, Marxist-Leninist Eddie intaking this information while knowing that social democratic reformists almost always support imperialism historically. And there's current Marxist-Leninist me, the T-1000 Terminator. 2019 Socialist Eddie who worked for Bernie Sanders. This is the 2019 me crying and clenching my fists. Actually, that's interesting. My buddy Brock just came into our house. He actually worked with me on the Bernie campaign and worked with Carlos. So what a coincidence. I'll bring Brock on stream sometime. But here's the video from Aaron Mate of Bernie defending Biden's decisions. You got anything to say about this, Carlos, before we jump in? Or?
No, let's watch it and then we'll break it down.
Yeah.
On an issue that I've been having.
Should America send F-16s?
It's not an issue that I've been heavily involved in, but I support what the president is doing. I think what Putin did was outrageous, not only for the people of the Ukraine and all the destruction, not only for the thousands and tens of thousands of Russian soldiers who have been dying. We need a world now, if we're going to combat climate change, if we're going to combat future pandemics, we need a world to come together. And Putin has radically disrupted that, and that is a real tragedy. But I think at the end of the day, the United States, NATO cannot sit back and allow Putin's aggression to go unresponded to.
Should America?
Well, did you hear what he said about Russian troops? He said he feels bad for the Russian troops who are dying. So I think this is probably Putin propaganda, and Bernie's probably in Putin's pocket. You're only allowed to feel bad for Ukrainian troops.
Oh God, it's just so bad. And this is what social democracy has always been. This is what social democracy has always been from the start. In the 1914 split in socialism, as Lenin described it, when the Social Democrats of the Second International voted, for war credits and, aligned with their national bourgeoisie up and against the interest of, colonized peoples and really the workers of the world. And here you have a very similar situation. If you look at what Russia is fighting for, what it's fighting against, and who supports Russia, there's no doubt that if you position yourself anywhere near to an anti-imperialist position, a position which prioritizes the interests of working people and of the oppressed and exploited at a global scale, there's no, there's no rejecting the fact that your position should be one that's in favor of Russia, and that at the very least is able to understand why it was that Russia did what it did in February of 2022, and be able to contextualize that in the long history of U.S. NATO-led provocations, from the eastward expansion of NATO to the 2014 Euromaidan coup, which was spearheaded by literal Nazis and fascists, which, very weird seeing a Jewish politician so vehemently support operations which include at the forefront people who, try to find one of them without a Nazi tattoo. Try, you won't be able to succeed. To the 14,000 dead in the Donbass region, mostly ethnically Russian, to a state that banned the Russian language, that, has recently banned unions, that banned the Communist Party, that any progressive force it comes into contact with, it literally just bans, that's escalating the world into a nuclear third world war in this whole context, while the president is giving, Congress is giving $100 billion to those forces, while Americans at home, are poorer than ever before, while there's, things like the Palestine-Ohio train wreck that's affecting, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Americans. And all of that is just being sidelined in order to continue funneling money and resources into this proxy war against Russia. And it's, it's absolutely ridiculous. And it's one of those contradictions that it's not just a contradiction of capital, but a contradiction of capital at the specific neo-imperialist stage in which we're in, where it's just become so glaringly obvious. And, the people of Palestine, Ohio, they can tell that something's going on that's not right. There's a contradiction at play when the American government, supposed to represent the American people, supposed to be a government of, by, and for the people, is over in Ukraine funding Nazis instead of helping the people at home which need it.
All right, and the only thing I would draw a distinction there, you said at the very least people should understand why Russia did what they did. For me, I draw the line at the very least is you should support the sovereignty of the Donbass. You should at least support the sovereignty of Donetsk and Lugansk, because people say, how can you support the Russian invasion, or how can you think that it's good? And for one, we're not making a moral judgment. We're not saying it's good. It's horrific. Tons of people are dying and infrastructure is being destroyed. What's horrific is that the U.S. has, created the conditions that allowed this to happen, though, or the Western finance capitalists have done the Euromaidan coup allowed thousands of people to be killed in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass region, have their homes shelled, forcing, essentially forcing Russia's hand while building up troops along the border. And if you think that's hyperbole, Angela Merkel literally said the peace agreements, the proposed Minsk agreements in 2014, were just a ploy, essentially, a way to hold Russia off while the U.S. and NATO built up military capacity in Ukraine and got ready to attack Russia. So, there are people who will say, well, I understand what the U.S. and NATO is doing, but that, Putin and Russia are equal evils in this conflict. And it's like, okay, then what should be done about the people in the Donbass? What should be done about their sovereignty? Should we just allow Ukrainian neo-Nazis armed by NATO to wipe these ethnic Russians off the face of the earth? Should we allow a NATO-sponsored genocide? Something needs to be done for those people. Okay, what should be done for them? Really, there's no other option except for a military operation. But then when Russia goes ahead with the military operation, the U.S. starts launching, starts funneling all of their resources into this location and escalating, blowing up Nord Stream, giving Ukraine the go-ahead to launch drones into Russia, into Russian territory, giving them the most high-powered weaponry we can, continually breaking up a peace agreement between Zelensky and Putin, continually pushing this narrative that we want to turn Ukraine into another Israel and, have them fight to the last Ukrainian, which essentially means, pushing the Ukrainian NATO pushing the Ukrainian troops at gunpoint into their death at the hands of Russia. So this insane point that the war has escalated to stems from NATO, but so it's not just Russia purposefully escalating like this. So then you say, okay, so maybe Russia shouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. Well, then what should be done about the people in the Donbass? Well, maybe just a small military operation to protect those people. Well, when that happens, NATO is going to escalate to this insane degree. So, you see NATO and finance capital, Western imperialist finance capital, no matter how you look at this conflict, from what angle, are the source of escalating it and allowing it to happen. And, something needs to be done to protect the people of the Donbass. You can't get around that fact. So that's that. I just want to give some more context to that, because people always talk about, they'll say, you guys think the Russian invasion was good. And like I said, it's not a moral judgment. It's, a strategic judgment, and looking at Russia's position within the global political and economic situation. Also looking at the historical development of Russia over the past few years, where Putin has, nationalized a lot of major industries and, moved not towards a new Soviet Union, but closer to the Soviet model and further away from the neoliberal economic shock therapy model that was induced on Russia by the West during the fall of the Soviet Union, which has caused a lot of ill will and, distaste towards the West among Russian people. So, there's a lot of historical conditions and developments here that need to be looked at and reviewed that are never, ever analyzed by Western media, who distill the whole thing to Putin bad, Putin evil. And, that's what Bernie does here in order to scapegoat his own position, which is supporting this proxy war, which is pushing the Ukrainian people to their death at gunpoint. He just distills it all down to we can't let Putin do this. We have to stop Putin from killing people. Well, Bernie, if you distill the conflict into that, you're ignoring what you're actually supporting. The arming and funding of ethno-nationalist militias who have been murdering people in the Donbass for 8 years. You're supporting the results and the escalations from a U.S.-backed coup in 2014 that allowed an extremely anti-Russian, extremely violent government to take power in Ukraine with neo-Nazis as their leadership. So, by isolating just Putin bad, Russia bad, I think the whole situation's bad and the U.S. is at fault, but Putin's still bad. Like, okay, right? We're not Putinists, we're communists, but we can recognize what role Russia's actually playing in this global conflict, and recognize that as communists, we need to focus our attacks on NATO and on the finance capitalists who created this situation, and that by saying Putin bad so that, you know, we feel a little better about ourselves in the eyes of bourgeois media doesn't really do anything, in my opinion.
You know who took Ukrainian sovereignty? It wasn't Russia in February 2022. It was the US in 2014. That's who took Ukrainian sovereignty. You can't take the sovereignty away from a country that hasn't been sovereign in 8 years, because its government has been led by a coup government that was input by a foreign power. And then when people voted for Zelensky as the candidate that would supposedly bring peace in the Donbass region, he completely folded, because when he got there, the Nazis told him that, you know, either you take our way and continue allowing us to do what we're doing, or we'll literally kill you. And then the good actor that he is, he just, you know, he's been playing the role. But it's completely absurd when you have even the slightest smidge of the context that has predated and been the precondition for what happened in February 2022. It's absurd to not put all of your attention on the US and NATO. It's just, you know, the only way that you can rationalize that is by saying that, you know, honestly, Bernie's bought off by the imperialists. That's it. That's the only way you could do it. I don't think he's ignorant enough, because mainstream bourgeois media has been saying since 2014 that there's a Nazi problem in Ukraine. They've admitted it. The same places that today consider it a conspiracy theory, or that downplay their Nazism into being, I don't know, just far right or right wing forces, or just nationalism. You know, pretty soon they'll start saying that the swastikas that they have are because they're Buddhist, and they're Buddhist swastikas, and that the skulls that they have are not the Nazi skulls. They're actually just fans of Pirates of the Caribbean and Jack Sparrow. I mean, for fuck's sake, you know, these guys were admitting it in 2014, 2015, 2016, and now they completely flip. You know, and I can't imagine someone like Bernie, who at least expresses a slight bit of critical thinking in other areas, doesn't know this, you know, but it's just the only way I can rationalize it is that these people are bought out, because there's no way that they're actually good faith agents and can continue to just be the mouthpieces of this horrific proxy war against Russia, which is just insane. We just had the one of the craziest acts of terrorism in the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. No one in the US media has asked anyone any questions. Has CNN or MSNBC had Seymour Hersh on to talk about that? Has any journalist questioned the politicians? Has anyone questioned Victoria Nuland, Anthony Blinken, Joe Biden, you know, the director of the CIA? Has anyone been questioned? No. No one has been fucking questioned. And it's a fact that the US blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. It's a fact. You know, so it's just completely absurd. There's no way to defend at all anything close to what the US is spinning as the narrative for this war. And it's just a complete disgrace, really. At this time, you know, it's a fight of humanity against these imperialist monsters that just want to continue tiptoeing us into nuclear Armageddon until all of us are fucking gone, and the only ones that are alive are the richest people in the world who could have gone to bonkers or gone to Mars or God knows where.
And I mean, the only kind of coverage, or any coverage, that we got of Seymour Hersh's article were just people calling him a Putin propagandist, which this guy has been a respected investigative journalist, you know, even in the mainstream in the US since the 60s and 70s. And there were just these comments on our TikTok that were so obviously being botted, like the likes on them were being botted, which we know NATO and the State Department and, you know, various private arms of the State Department, like NED connected groups, have pretty much been using social media bots for every issue now, or every sort of crisis that comes up, any kind of regime change effort that they want. Part of the strategy for influencing control of information and public opinion is going to be social media bots, which of course, you know, we shouldn't think of that like a conspiracy type claim to make. Of course they're going to use bots if they have that technology, and, you know, social media is how so many people consume information. Like when you see comments about Seymour Hersh being in the pocket of Putin and it's got 60 likes, it's like, okay, this is pretty obvious what's going on here. But what I mean with Bernie, I don't understand because like he was against the war in Iraq. I believe he was against the war in Afghanistan. But then when it comes to like the NATO carpet bombing of Yugoslavia at the end of 1999, he was all in favor of it. And then when it comes to the proxy war being waged by NATO against Russia, he's in favor of it. So is he in the pocket of NATO? You know, is he tied to only certain interests of the ruling class? Is it this? I think, you know, my theory more so than him being bought off is that it's the social pressure that comes from the Democratic Party for certain interventions. Bernie feels a loyalty to the Democratic Party. He truly, truly feels that the Democrats are better than the Republicans. And he has to, in certain instances, with core issues of the Democratic Party, toe the party line, go along with them. And right now, this is the number one, the primary goal of the Democratic Party is to continue waging this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. So I think it's almost the social pressure of his co-workers in Washington and in the Democratic Party that leads Bernie to support these just murderous, heinous interventions with a humanitarian disguise.
The lesser of two evils people are really going to have to bring in, you know, mathematicians to see, you know, what the hell is actually less evil for 2024, because we have one party that's willing to put all its beans in a proxy war against Russia that's escalating into a potential nuclear war, and then another one that wants to put all its beans in a proxy war with Taiwan, and then the vast majority of both agree with what the other side is doing. So what the hell, you know? Now you have Trump pretending to be running as a peace candidate. You know, we know he's very hawkish on some things, but really, if he runs as a peace candidate, is he the lesser of two evils? You know, and that's not to say that you know, we should endorse Trump or vote for Trump. You know, far from that. It's just
Midwestern Marx endorses Trump.
endorses Trump, right. But I'm trying to point out the you know, the logical fallacies of this lesser of two evils ism. And you know, there's people that predicted and that are on record predicting that something big like what we've seen with Russia was going to happen as soon as the Democratic administration came to power, and that for that reason they voted for the other side. But you know, I don't think that the response is in either side, obviously, and I think that if you know the conditions wherever fertile, the conditions that we have now are as fertile as they have ever been in U.S. history for creating, you know, an independent socialist movement outside of the two imperialist fascistic parties. So you know, if any effort that we have that's not guided towards that, towards achieving working class unity, and towards creating a genuine third party that mobilizes the masses of American working people, it's just, you know, towing the line that's only taking us towards nuclear devastation of the whole planet.
Absolutely. It's like horseshoe theory, but that's usually the theory that communism is the same as, you know, a far right-wing government and the same as fascism. They're a horseshoe. They meet in the middle. You just have to shrink down that horseshoe. It's center left and center right. You know, the two bourgeois political parties that pretend to be left and right, that's where the horseshoe is. That's where they're connected, and they both serve the same class. There's no horseshoe between communism and fascism. There's only communists are the ones who defeat the fascists every time. But just in contrast to Bernie, you know, we have China releasing their position on the political settlement in Ukraine. This is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. And I mean, this is the kind of foreign policy we could have if we, you know, had a socialist country instead of a country where our choices are between two bourgeois parties, right? And this shows the actual socialist position on this issue, the actual position of peace and mutual cooperation and mutual development is what China calls it. So they want a foreign policy based on trade, based on cooperation, and based on the idea that, you know, if we make ourselves stronger, and more or economically stronger and productively stronger, then that will also make our allies stronger. So therefore, we should build up the productive bases of our allies, build up the economies of our allies, so that we can work together and work in each other's mutual benefit. Whereas, it's literally the opposite, an inversion of the U.S. foreign policy of we're going to exploit your resources, extract your resources, control you. And then as Lenin realizes in imperialism, or lays out in imperialism, the productive forces of the target country are prevented from developing. They only develop around whatever industry is being super exploited by the multinational companies. And their productive forces don't develop in a diverse way, in a way that's good for a flourishing economy and a diverse economy. So that's the kind of foreign policy we want to move to. And Bernie, the most far left socialist politician in the U.S., is not even close. He's supporting proxy war and lining the pockets of the military-industrial complex, and he's supporting the Cold War mentality of NATO, which is, their broader strategy. Vijay Prashad has a really good article called "The World Doesn't Want a Global NATO," published for Consortium News, where he talks about this NATO summit, where they said their strategy going forward, and I believe 2021 and on, was targeting Russia and China, and that these are viewed as the biggest threats to world peace and freedom and democracy and all these buzzwords. So it's a return of the same Cold War mindset and the same Cold War strategy, and this does nothing but divide. This does nothing but tear countries down. And for those of you who are following along with our imperialism reading guide, eventually we're going to get to a chapter called The Decay of Imperialism. And it's about how these imperialist countries undergo a process of financialization where they become dominated by finance capital. They lose all their productive industry and their productive base, and the conditions for working people in the imperial core become worse and worse and worse as the system decays. And that's exactly what we're looking at now in the U.S., the imperial core, and in West Europe as well. The imperial core is decaying. We're riddled with economic crises. We've got this crisis of inflation that's only getting worse. And all our government can do is funnel more money into proxy war in Ukraine. Take the surplus of our working people and funnel it away towards war. So this position of China should be the future of foreign policy. And this situation, the war in Ukraine, should make it clear to everyone watching, former Bernie people or whoever, anyone who considers themselves a leftist, that Bernie and AOC and these reformist politicians are not it. They are not anti-imperialists. The way forward is Marxism, Leninism, and anti-imperialism. The way forward is building a system similar to China, based on mutual cooperation and development, not, voting for a bunch of quote unquote justice Democrats or uncorrupted Democrats.
There's no left, man. I'm sorry to say it, but if what passes as left in the U.S. are people that are willing to support their government's funding of a fascist state, I'm not calling that left. There's nothing about that that's left wing. You can put a chicken costume on a duck and it's still gonna be a duck. It makes no sense calling this a left. There was also a vote a week or so ago on whether we should punish China over the so-called spy balloon. Everyone voted in favor of it. That means that every quote-unquote DSA socialist in Congress voted in favor of punishing China for a supposed spy balloon, a balloon that had been tracked from the beginning by the U.S., that was trackable, that they could have, if they really thought it was a spy balloon, shot down before it even got into the U.S., that they waited a day or so in order for it to travel, for people to record it, for there to be hysteria, and so that they can make this big, spectacle around the balloon that's used to wage their ideological war against China as we approach a real war against China that's, going to be the essence of the new Cold War that we have in our age, which might be hot. It might not even be cold. So this fucking balloon, which was a private civilian, meteorological balloon, is the reason why every socialist in Congress, let alone everyone else, the Democrats and every Republican, voted in favor of punishing China, when U.S. balloons of a similar character have been found in every other fucking country, and no one else has had such a hissy fit
Oh no,
over it as the U.S. Did I freeze? Did I freeze?
I think I froze. I think my Wi-Fi went down a sec. Here for a sec.
But yeah, I mean, to call these people anything left is just absurd, or at least not socialist. So it's very sad. And then the paradox is that at the same time, the American people are more pro-peace than ever. Poll after poll shows that the American people are against the efforts of the U.S.'s proxy war against Russia. So we have a condition where the sentiment of the vast majority of American people are less and less and less able to be represented by their quote unquote representatives. And I don't know what better objective conditions a socialist can hope for than the ones that we find ourselves in right now. We have something that's very special about our crisis, which is that we are the imperial hegemon, and we're challenged not just nationally, but we're being challenged internationally. We're challenged by the flowering of a multipolar world order that not only signifies the end of U.S. unipolarity since 1991 and the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, but it signifies, in my view at least, the end of the Colombian era that has started since 1492 and that has marked the whole development of European colonialism and imperialism. It's a genuine new era in world history that we're entering into. So there's what I have called in the past, a comprehensive crisis. Everything is fucked, just to put it in layman's term, everything is fucked, and the situation is wonderful. There's this Mao phrase that he used to say, the situation in heaven is chaotic, that is excellent. I'm misquoting it, but it was something along the lines of when everything is shitty, that's the best time for changing the world. And, when the people that are supposed to be in charge of the movement to change the world in a radical revolutionary manner are still involved in the petty realpolitik of these two fascist imperialist parties, they're not going to be able to play their historical revolutionary role. And ultimately, they're going to be agents that continue to perpetuate us down the road that we're going, which is nuclear Armageddon. There's no way around it. So it's a very scary route that we're heading towards. And if there's people that might not agree with me on a variety of other things that do agree with me on fighting against imperialism, against empire, against the security state, then those, as far as I'm concerned, are closer to being my allies than these so-called socialists in Congress that continue to perpetuate empire and then pay lip service to a Medicare for all that they have never had the balls to fight for.
Right. Don't fall for the bourgeois framework of seeing everything in terms of left and right and liberal and democratic party. Organize people, speak with people based on their positions, what they believe, find people who are skeptical of the war and ally with them. And I mean, this is why we label ourselves, define ourselves as Marxists and Socialists. We're something distinct from either bourgeois party, so to say, just, the Democrats are further left. So therefore we have to support them. It's irrational, and it doesn't make any sense in an era of imperialism where the Democrats are pushing us towards nuclear war. But yeah, I think we covered all that pretty well. I think it's been a good stream. Went for almost 3 hours. So yeah, you got anything else you want to add or say before we sign off here, Carlos? I already promoted the Patreon once.
Well, I'm very excited to say that the book that I've been working on for basically, in reality, a few years now, is ready. It's in the last stages of copy editing, and we have a set release date on March 20th. We just got responses from a variety of Marxist authors who, are very influential for the book. and they will be providing endorsements, which we're very excited about. But so expect my book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Marxism, to be released at on March 20th. And honestly, I'm extremely excited about this. It really represents, at least for me, a culmination of some of the central ideas that I have been able to develop along with Eddie and Noah and Tom and others from the Institute in thinking through these troubling times and searching for ideological clarity and understanding why it is that we continue to see these different failures of the left, and seeing ultimately that they're not disconnected, that they're grounded in a worldview which we have come to label the purity fetish. So I'm really excited about this book, and I look forward to the comments of the people who are able to read it. So yeah. Oh, you're muted, Eddie.
Whoops, I was just saying absolutely, I'm excited as well. I don't know what's coming for me, still working on my Venezuela book slowly but surely. But I've really enjoyed spending less time making TikTok. So, I'm sure eventually we'll get back on TikTok and utilize it for the big platform it is. Today I had some people in our Discord server secretly upload some TikToks for me to try and, it's like me speaking to TikTok back from the dead, but from beyond the grave. But either way, spending a lot more time creating content for YouTube, spending more time writing and stuff. So just really appreciate everyone's support. As I said earlier, you can become a YouTube member now and you get some perks specific to YouTube. But yeah, really appreciate all y'all's support, whether just watching the stream and showing solidarity, sharing, commenting, liking, or those of you who go the extra mile and support us financially. Either way, everything we do would be impossible without you. Also, shout out to our newest graphic designer, Kyle, who we've been working with. He's been doing some great work, so I want to give him a shout out. Really helping us add an edge of professionalism to our project, helping us combat these folks like PragerU, who have all this money dumped into their aesthetic and their form of presentation. So we're always trying to improve, always trying to get better. And we couldn't do that without you all. So unless you have anything to say, Carlos, I think we can close it out there. Solidarity, everyone.
Thank you to all of those who sticked around, and we'll roll out with the introductory video that we start with. Thank you.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.